Astonishing Legends Network.
Listen to the Astonishing Junk Drawer exclusively at patreon.com/astonishinglegends.
A giant up on a mountain range.
I just got stopped by like some CIA agent.
You know there's something right behind you.
What?
Ed, you seem like you have something you want to say.
I don't think you can park there.
So you've been to Point Pleasant.
It's near a Cheesecake Factory. This is all looking up. Men in Black, law enforcement thing.
If he was shooting that on the way up, he would have had to go way out of his way.
CIA or...
I just want to give you an update. I'm not dead.
Well, that's why this is on Patreon.
Legends are still being created right now.
Astonishing Legends would like to thank Mint Mobile, Cremo Body Wash, ZocDoc, Squarespace, our contributors at patreon.com, and you, our listeners, for making tonight's show possible.
On July 20th, 1988, a young man named Christopher Davis was on his way home from a late shift at a McDonald's in rural Bishopville, South Carolina. Davis lived about 10 miles away, and that night, his 1975 Toyota Celica got a flat tire. He was at least a half mile from any houses and still 7 miles from his own home. So his only choice was to swap the flat for his spare and see if he could make it. He had broken down right in the middle of Scape Ore Swamp, 280 square miles of blackwater swamp that might harbor all kinds of strange creatures. And on that night, one of them was about to make itself known to Christopher Davis. Davis had just finished putting the spare onto his car and was putting his jack and lug wrench away when he saw something rapidly approaching him from a tree line in the swamp about 30 yards away. Whatever it was not only moving fast, it appeared to be running on 2 legs. But it wasn't human. As it got closer, Davis told the local sheriff that he could see it was some kind of reptile-like being, or even a giant lizard. Davis didn't want to stick around to find out. He fumbled with his keys, starting his car and slamming the gas pedal to the floor in an attempt to get away from it. His story might end there, but if it did, this wouldn't be an astonishing legend, would it?
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
There have been strange noises heard in the swamp for years. Animals have been found pulled apart, and nobody's ever explained the woman whose head was twisted off at Ashwood Pond near the swamp 15 years ago. Sumter resident Joy Reese quoted from a newspaper article in Lyle Blackburn's book, Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster.
Join us tonight for our episode on the Lizard Man of Bishopville with our special guest, Lyle Blackburn.
And we're back.
That we are, folks. We got a great show for you tonight.
Yes, we do. And we're looking forward to seeing folks at Monster Fest 2024 next weekend in Canton, Ohio. So if you can make it to that, please do. We'd love to see you in person.
It's going to be a lot of fun. And on top of that, we'll be right next to tonight's guest, Lyle Blackburn, on the convention floor. So you can stop by and say hello to all of us at once.
Wow, it's a package deal. Even though we announced our summer break on our last show, we know some of you didn't hear it. So just to get everyone up to speed, we've just wrapped up a 4-week break to do some prep on another new show we're working on. But we're back now, and after this week's show, we'll have a new one next week as well that will have been recorded live at Monster Fest with the guys from Scared All the Time.
That's right. And then we're dark for 1 week and back with 2 more in a row. This is a summer operation schedule. The show will get back to our regular bi-weekly schedule at the end of the summer as we lead into the fall and the spooky season.
Oh boy. Well, let's get into tonight's episode on the Lizard Man. Well, the Lizard Man is known by several names, more geographically Lizard Man of Scape Ore Swamp, and is also called the Lizard Man of Lee County. So the running theme here is Lizard Man. But it's also broken down into very specific geographical locations, increasing in area size.
Yeah, Lyle goes into great detail on the possible origins of the name of the Scape Ore Swamp in his book, Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster. There's a lot of possibilities on where it came from, some not so flattering, but the research he and his research partner, Cindy Lee, did on it is fascinating. So if you want to know more about that, pick his book up. There's a link to it in the show notes, of course.
Well, it's an interesting and curious name. And of course, you want to know where did it come from. And if you just say it phonetically, it's not that far off to some of the historical origins, possibly.
Yeah.
Yes, you can read about that, but it is. It might be what you think. saying it over and over again.
Yeah, the one I was shocked about, I hadn't occurred to me until I read that. Oh, and then I was like, oh yeah, of course. But anyway, again, that's in Lyle's book. Check it out. It's pretty fascinating. Well, when it comes to the story of the lizard man, there is no more knowledgeable expert on it than Lyle, the author, cryptid hunter, podcaster, small town monsters narrator, and hot sauce creator. He's been on our show before, Lyle Blackburn. We've known him a few years now. And like we said, we're going to be hanging out with him at MonsterFest next weekend, and he graciously agreed to be a guest on Astonishing Legends for a second time now to share his extensive knowledge on the Lizard Man case.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Lyle here in a bit. And I just wanted to say, when you start to research this whole event here, you're right. There is no one who has compiled more articles, talked to actual real people that were there at the time, and has gathered more information. So we're going to really follow his book pretty closely because it is the Bible on this incident here. We first wanted to share the story behind how this whole thing got started. The first event linked to it was an attack on a parked car, but there's another incident that takes precedent, and maybe one before that even. And that's the story you heard about in the cold open with Christopher Davis and his encounter. So, Scott, why don't you start out with that article? Because I think this is a perfect encapsulation of how these things are viewed by the community.
All right, so this was written by George Gorgas for a paper called The Item, based in Sumter, South Carolina, and this was published on July 20th, 1988. The headline is Bumps in the Night, Lee County Seeks Lizard, in quotes, with bad attitude. There's something amiss in the Browntown community, where a mystery creature described as a scaly lizard has reportedly been making waves in the Scape Ore Swamp. 17-year-old Christopher Davis said he was recently attacked by a 7-foot lizard-type creature while changing a flat tire on Browntown Road. He said its searing red eyes, 3-clawed fingers, and snake-like scales made him initially believe he was under siege by the devil himself. 2 other men told Lee County Sheriff's Deputy Chester Lightly about 2 weeks ago they were also chased by a similar beast while they were getting water from a spring. The mystery has fed on rumors, which have multiplied since Tom and Mary Way's car was mauled last Thursday night while they slept. Their Ford's torn molding, indented sidewalls, broken hood ornament, along with red hairs and footprints left behind, indicate some animal was responsible. A wildlife officer on the scene said he would guess the damage was caused by a red fox. Nary a Lee County resident hasn't heard of the Lizard Man, a.k.a. the Swamp Monster, and each person by now has developed definite opinions about it. Waitress Lynn Mathis says she doesn't believe in such things. It must have been that one-eyed cow that lives around here. I don't know if they can go 40 miles per hour, though, she joked. One man she was waiting on then piped in. I don't know if it's a one-eyed cow, but I do know they make some good whiskey back in that swamp, suggesting people in high spirits can easily misrepresent what they see. A Texaco cashier said she initially doubted the stories, but she knows enough Browntown residents who swear by the creature that she has become convinced. Davis said he saw the creature about 3 weeks ago. The soft-spoken teenager seemed shaken as he described his encounter. He was heading home about 2 a.m. and pulled over to change a flat tire. I wasn't drinking, and I know what I saw, he said. I had just put the tire in the trunk when I see this thing coming from those trees, about 50 yards away, kicking up dust as it ran. He said the creature grabbed the car door just as Davis sped off. When he reached 40 miles per hour, he said he noticed it had caught up with him. I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw something, and I heard a crash on the roof. But he said he was able to escape with no more than a scratch on his fender. The reported sightings and the widespread attention given to the story by the media from Columbia, Charleston, and Florence have created a stir in the county. Columbia radio station WCOS has offered a $1 million reward to anyone bringing in the lizard thing alive. Station operations manager Jerry McCracken said he believes the creature would be of considerable value to the Smithsonian Institute as well to the general public. Quote, if this is real, we'd put it in a cage and charge people a quarter each to look at it, and I'm sure we'd make the money back, end quote. On a Browntown Road bridge, the point that locals consider the gateway to the swamp, as many as 9 vehicles were parked at different times yesterday. Traffic on the road was steady from morning to midnight, something local woodsmen say is a direct result of the sightings. 4 local friends, each about 20 years old, brought rifles and trucks to the bridge in an effort to do a little sightseeing and maybe collect a reward. Asked if he would try to spare the creature and thus meet the main requirement for collecting the money, Tony White replied, damn straight, I wouldn't have to work a day in my life. White said he was familiar with the swamp as he prepared to join his friends on an expedition through the boggy abyss. I've cut 185 days of school here and loved every minute of it. The four insisted the monster lore was probably nothing more than a bear. I've seen bears, big cats, and all kinds of things in there, but never a green, scaly creature, White said. Edward Brown, 24, said he had heard stories about the sound of chains being dragged across the road. That's about all I ever heard about, a dragging chain being heard. I've never heard this other stuff. The four had been at the Way House, exploring the area in search of tracks. That's the house, for our listeners, where the car had been attacked a few weeks earlier, before Christopher Davis's encounter. Lee County Sheriff Liston Truesdale said tracks found near where the car had been battered might belong to a bear. But James Knight, a Bishopville carpenter, disputed that, saying the tracks were aligned in a straight procession, typical of human steps. Scape Ore's a bad swamp, known for snakes, but never legends. The only legend I've ever heard was at the nearby church. This lady was killed by her husband with an axe. A true story is the subject of many swamp tales. The axe was then used as a grave marker when she was buried there, Knight said. About 2 years ago, the axe was stolen. Davis said he had heard stories about an overgrown slimy lizard as far back as 2 years ago, but he didn't pay attention to it at the time. Whether the creature is a giant lizard, a panther, a bear, a one-eyed cow, or as one man suggested, an alligator running on its back legs, the imagination of Lee County residents will be all the better for it. And if rumors persist and the swamp is turned into a tourist attraction of Loch Ness fame, folks in Lee County say they won't mind. As White put it, this is the most excitement we've had in a long time. So that connects us back to the July 88. It's a pretty tongue-in-cheeky article, but there's still some interesting details in there.
It is, I think, very typical and charming in a way about how people react in a small town community when something like this happens. And, small town monsters, that's what it's all about. And people kind of react the same way no matter where it's at. And like so many creature sightings, there often seems to be one incident that gels into the lore as the first sighting or incident, like Mothman swooping down and chasing the kids at Makeout Lane. But if you do a little digging, you find that the cemetery workers claim to have seen it or something like it fly up into the air. Do you remember that? It was like a week or two before. And its wings seemingly not flapping enough to account for its ascent, which was interesting. So, or as with the Enfield monster or Momo, there are often reports of people seeing something fitting the description sometime before what gets remembered as the first encounter. So usually there's one event here, and in this case, it's Christopher Davis's sighting, but that's not the first one, and it doesn't end there. It didn't begin there. So I find that this pattern so fascinating and how this kind of all plays out. So it's a very good case to look at, I think. And I'm hoping something happens sometime in our time here where we now have the wherewithal to look into it.
This is a young man. He said, okay, I'm not drinking. Of course, no, a lot of people say, oh, of course I'm not drinking. That's like, I'm not guilty in jail, but he wasn't. He was coming from work.
Yes. Okay. So maybe the drinking maybe inspires you at the time to make up something goofy, but that's getting back to, the goblins, Kelly Hopkinsville. Like, it doesn't really make you see crazy, fantastical things.
Yeah, it doesn't make you hallucinate. Exactly. Right. And he was coming from work at McDonald's. He was wrapping up his shift. It's just, if he says he wasn't drinking, he's just trying to get home. It's 2:30 in the morning. Right. It all makes sense. He's from McDonald's to going home. He was so scared when he got home, he left the car running when he ran inside to tell his dad what was happening. Mm-hmm. I think that's fascinating. And also, like we said, the article's a little campy, but Sheriff Truesdale believed Christopher's story. This was a real live investigator, but he was also acquainted with Christopher's dad, Tommy, and he believed them both about the story. So
he took it seriously, and he went by exacting police protocol and taking all the reports. And you just get so tired when the authorities just kind of dismiss it. And then something bad happens. Yeah. And then they kind of backtrack. But here he took it seriously from the start because it's a small town. He knew these people. Well, what about Browntown and Bishopville? Here's just a little bit of a background on it. Browntown is an unincorporated community in northwestern Lee County, South Carolina. It's about 4 miles west of Bishopville. It's in the category or status of a census-designated place, or what they call a CDP. Not very big. In 2020, the population was about 206 people. But Browntown is considered the gateway to Scape Ore Swamp, and the swamp being the southwest edge of the community. And Scape Ore Swamp is a tributary of the Black River.
People might laugh at this, but it's also part of the PD River Basin, which is Peedee, and that runs through North Carolina. I drive across a portion of that basin myself whenever I go down to the beach or something.
Right.
It's because they have the Yadkin and the PD and the Little PD River, Peedee, which my son thought all of those names were hilarious. So. I think a lot of them come from the indigenous cultures in North Carolina. Like it's a weird
Anglicization.
Yes.
Right. There you go.
So.
Of something more native. So that's just how names and words get boiled down, as we've always talked about. Well, what about Bishopville? Bishopville is just the larger adjacent community, but it's still a small town in Lee County, South Carolina. But it's also the county seat of Lee County. So it's an important town there. And 2010, the population was just 3,471. It's about 2.4 square miles in area size.
Right. So that's where the McDonald's was that Christopher worked at. Well, now that everyone's up to speed on the instigating incident, this seems like a good time to bring Lyle into the studio.
Well, again, when you punch up, how do I get information on the lizard man? Which isn't just a collection of either passed around stories that get watered down and a lot of misinformation. This is the definitive source for all this because he's already done that. Lyle did all this stuff. He actually went there. Lyle drove from Dallas about 14 hours to interview people in Bishopville. So why not talk to the man who was actually there, someone we consider a good friend, and his research partner, Cindy Lee, who compiled this book and actually got a lot of the information straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. Sheriff Liston Truesdale, who you could say was at the point of the funnel here, getting all this information and being responsible with it, and is a trusted source. So let's introduce Lyle.
All right, folks, we would like to welcome Lyle Blackburn back to Astonishing Legends. He was on the show back in June of 2019 for an episode called Lyle Blackburn Cryptid Hunter. I would definitely say to go back and listen to that if you haven't heard it. But we wanted to have him on now for this show about the Lizard Man because he is the ultimate expert on this. He wrote a book on it, and he was gracious enough to agree to come on with us. And the other thing is that the timing for this episode, it's lining up for us perfectly because we're about to all go to Monster Fest. We're going to see him there. We're actually, our table is next to his, which it was last year too, which is awesome because he's going to bring a bunch of killer hot sauce and among other things. So we're looking forward to meet him. Lyle, welcome back to Astonishing Legends.
Thanks for having me.
I want to get the shameless plug in at the top of the interview rather than at the end because, man, do I love your hot sauce.
Monster sauce?
Yes, again, shameless plug. Usually you get these things like, oh, it's not bad. It's one of my favorite sauces. If you love hot sauce, there's 3 varieties that I got. The Howlin' Habanero.
The other is Swamp Sensation, and that's the green verde jalapeno-based sauce. And my original, which is Rogue Red Chili, which is kind of a milder sauce that you can kind of use universally. So I've got the 3 sort of heat
levels. Yeah.
Levels. And yeah, the sauce, it kind of started as just something, a silly, fun idea because I've done some stuff with Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. I wrote a song and done a video with her with my band Ghoultown, but she came out with a sauce and it kind of had this little caricature of her on there. Yeah. And somebody had recently done one of me with a hat, kind of a caricature. I thought, man, the sauce is cool. I live in Texas. I should have a hot sauce.
You got the street cred. Yeah.
I set out to do this thinking it would be cool to set on the table. Well, I found a bottler and a guy to work with outside of Fort Worth, and we made the sauce, and I started selling it, and people were like, this is like the greatest sauce ever. And it was selling very well. And then they're asking, man, do you have other flavors or a hotter one? So now I'm up to 3, but it's fun and people love it. And that's what I love most is it is like, it's not a gimmick. Like they're like, oh, I'll make hot sauce. They're like, the next thing you know, they'll buy it. And then a month later, I get an order for like 5 of them on my website.
Yeah. That's what I did. This is no vanity sauce, folks. This is the real deal, and it makes a great gift.
And then what's the best place to get that is lyleblackburn.com?
Yes. Yeah, my online store there. And it's available in, and some of the listeners here will probably know some of these establishments like at North American Bigfoot Museum, Cliff Barrickman's Museum. You can get it there. You can get it at the Expedition Bigfoot Museum in Georgia, Legends and Lore Pizza in Tennessee, all sort of the themed.
Yeah, your corner of the market there. Yeah.
Yeah, they sell, and it's been a fun thing, and hey, people love it.
No, we're so glad you are doing it and keeping it up, and I just wanted to give you a shout out because I think the last time we talked was on a very monstrous return flight from Monster Fest last year in Canton, Ohio, and it was brutal, folks. And Lyle and I ended up in the the Spirit Airlines lounge for a couple of hours with some flight delays. And so we got to talking, and so I'm happy for that, to get to know you a little bit better.
You just came off a trip yourself out west, right? This past week?
Yes, occasionally I do get to go west, and this was just more exploration of the mountains in northern New Mexico. My family has a cabin out there, and most people, when you think of New Mexico, you don't think of mountains. But in the northern part, there's the Carson National Forest and the Sangre de Cristo mountain region, and the elevation up there is up to 13,000 feet. So it's way up there. Beautiful mountain scenery and just heavily forested with rivers and streams and waterways flowing down from that. So I spent a week out there doing some horseback riding and a lot of hiking up in there, and just enjoying the great outdoors.
There are areas in the mountains there that are known for their heavily supernatural presence, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, New Mexico is trying to get into that Southwest sort of vibe where they have UFOs, you've got skinwalkers, you've got dogman, all kinds of scary stuff, even Bigfoot sightings. Although the odd thing about it is when I'm in those mountains up there, it just looks like prime Bigfoot habitat. Yet I've talked to a lot of locals and looked into it, and I've even done a presentation in that little town, Red River. There is not a lot of Bigfoot sightings, but in a way, I think that adds credibility to just Bigfoot as a whole. When you're in a place where it looks like Bigfoot should be, that there's a bunch of sightings, I'm like, that's kind of cool, because you just look at this and think, man, there must be Bigfoots running amok. And I mean, there's bears, and there's a certain, I mean, every time I go out walking, you have to be concerned about bears. So there's the habitat to support a large creature. But, you know, that's kind of cool, because it just kind of goes to show you that Bigfoot isn't just something that when there's a big forest, there's people saying there's Bigfoot.
But I would say with the lizard man here, I'm not sure if your other monsters that you've covered, you tell us, but one that's been so embraced by the community, that's one of the things I noticed about the story here, is that, yeah, it's a fun thing. And then you realize, like, people just kind of ran with it, and it got silly, but people are allowed to have fun with it, I think. When it's in your territory, you've claimed this thing for yourself. But what I loved about your book is that it got underneath all that, and it said, well, what's really going on here? And then you actually went there, and you talked to the people, and you talked to the main character there, who was at the center of it all, as we said, Sheriff Liston Truesdale. And you couldn't have gotten more central with it and gotten more in the swamp, in the weeds, as they say, with the story. And then you found out there's a lot more to it. Have you gotten information from people locally or on your own research that there continued to be reports coming out of South Carolina?
There have been some scant reports in the years that have followed, and there certainly was beyond 1988, when the whole kind of crazy media thing was going on. And, you know, usually you hear Chris Davis's sighting repeated and maybe followed up with a couple others. But for several years after, there was some really bizarre and very credible sightings, and credible in part due to the sheriff's office, who kind of took it seriously. I mean, in the years that have followed, there's no sort of like a lot of recurring sightings like right there in you know, New Bishopville. But I certainly have fielded a lot of upright reptilian humanoid type cryptid reports. The main thing is that where a lot of these cases, and even if there's multiple sightings, you don't usually have a police investigation. And Liston Truesdale, whether he believed there was a lizard man or just what it was, he followed through, whereas most authorities would not. And that gave that case an extra interesting dimension, so that when I went out there, I mean, I went to his house, like I start in the book. I mean, that was all true, like going to his house in the dark, and he just opened up this chest, and there was 2 feet stack of papers that were police documents, that were newspaper clippings, or photos. He said, here's the whole case. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. We're talking about a cryptid here. And yet I'm sitting in the house of a retired sheriff who was well trained.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at this stack of documents. You just don't have that in any case.
No, that is amazing. And it's my understanding there's a sheriff in Trinidad, Colorado, that's kind of done something similar with cattle mutilations down there near the southern border of Colorado in that area. You almost never get that because they don't investigate, they don't take it seriously or whatever. It's so great. And then the other thing that Forrest and I have encountered on the show over the years is the older the story gets, the more the files disappear. They purged them. There was a fire. There was a flood. They just threw it out because it was a bunch of crap in air quotes that was in the corner. Why do we have that? So the fact that he had all that stuff, he's got it home. He's got it in a footlocker, which is straight out of a movie or whatever. He is like opening up. He's like that. He's collecting all that. That's really, really great. So like, and when you got there and you met him that first time, like what was his disposition like after all these years? Was he still just like, I still want to know what this was?
Yeah, I definitely got that feeling that it was sort of that unsolved mystery that he could never really quite wrap up. And I felt that his mind was like our mind. He was just trying to figure it out. And I think he's just sort of came to the point where he's like, well, whether the lizard man is a physical thing or no matter what it was, it is now a part of this town's history. It's a big chunk of my life because ever since then, people ask him about it. So I felt that he really wanted to know the answer, but of course, do we ever find the answer? And it's elusive. So that was kind of a cool aspect. And one part of the book is just sort of this guy's quest to investigate this and keep an open mind. So the book is not just here's some sightings. It's like, here's this phenomenon that gripped this town, and the sheriff who he and his deputies, had to look into this in a serious way. It was very interesting.
That's what I found very refreshing about this approach and the book and your coverage of it, is that this guy took it seriously, but not so much that he was already a big cryptid head and a real paranormal enthusiast. He is coming at it from the perspective of dedicated law enforcement. They're not sure what's going on, but they know something is going on. And that's what I felt about Sheriff Truesdale, is that he wanted to solve this as a case, like what is happening here in my county. I need to get to the bottom of this because he's getting very credible reports from people that he trusts at least.
And he believed his witnesses. He didn't just, he was drunk. He's an uneducated redneck or whatever. Like he was like, no, this guy's being honest. This one's being honest too. He could figure it out. He's like, no, this guy believes whatever he saw. Maybe he doesn't know what it was, but he believes he saw something that he can't explain, versus other people are like just jumping on the hoax train or the publicity train or whatever.
Right. And I mean, you got to think this is a seasoned lawman who he's investigated murders.
Yeah.
So when Christopher Davis comes in there, he's got a sense of whether this kid's telling the truth right off the bat. And he knew Christopher Davis's father. Yeah. And he kind of kept stressing that to me, that very point that, he said these people were being truthful. And then some of the ones that saw it before Christopher Davis, George Plyler and George Holloman and those guys, I mean, I don't know how well he knew them, but he knew these people in the community. And he says, these are people who are just not coming in here making up stories. So that, having that perspective from a lawman who could suss out whether people are telling the truth. And for him to, obviously he kept investigating it. So he believed these people.
Hey man, did you know the first day of summer was only a few days ago? It was the 20th of June.
Really? I thought it started weeks ago with the blazing hot temperatures we've been having.
I know it's been ridiculously hot out here too, and on top of that, we've got the humidity.
But I tell you what, even when you got that sweltering heat delirium stewing you into a stupor, nothing snaps you back into a cold sweat rude awakening like realizing you've been overpaying a fortune for wireless service.
Wow, okay, nice transition. Also nice impression. You're right, though. You do get that sour little twinge when you think of the hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars you've been burning up by overpaying for wireless, especially when you realize it's not like you got any better call quality, tons more data, or even VIP treatment. You just got hidden fees, caps, and less money for things you really need. And then you think to yourself, how have I been affording this?
Well, you were affording it because you were giving up something you really wanted and not getting more for your money. And it's best not to think about these things. But you can fix this right now and never look back at your losses by switching to Mint Mobile right now and getting unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month.
It's one of the easiest things you can do to say goodbye to overpriced wireless plans, their jaw-dropping monthly bills and unexpected overages, and still enjoy the call quality coverage and plentiful data that Forrest and I have been enjoying since we switched.
Let Mint Mobile rescue you with their premium wireless plans, and all plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts.
Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's limited time deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month.
To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/AL.
That's mintmobile.com/AL.
Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/AL.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month.
New customers on first 3-month plan only.
Speeds slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan.
Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply.
See Mint Mobile for details. You remember the first time you heard of Cremo body wash?
Well, heck yeah, I do, because it was one of those included items we got when we received one of those hip and cool high-end subscription gift boxes. My first thought before even trying it was that, man, this must be some exclusive stuff and what the upper class used, because all of the other items were so artisan and curated. Two of your favorite terms there. But after I used Cremo, I've sought it out to make it one of my go-to grooming products.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff. And the good news is that it's now easily attainable. No curation or artisaning required.
Nope, and we'll tell you where you can get it in a bit.
Yes, because it's time you elevated and enhanced your hygiene routine with Cremo body wash.
Wait, what are you trying to tell me?
Not you specifically,
okay.
Because every guy could stand some elevation and enhancement when it comes to getting crisp and clean and smelling good.
Well, I'll agree with you there, because Cremo combines rich lathering and hydrating formulas with meticulously balanced, multi-layered fragrances for a superior shower experience.
You sound like an ad, man.
Well, yeah, I thought that's what we're doing here, but it also happens to be true. Cremo's newest men's body wash set makes a regular shower feel like a luxury experience, as I was getting at earlier. Their bourbon vanilla body wash invigorates the senses with bold distiller's spices perfectly balanced with notes of rich Madagascar vanilla and aged oak to create a shower experience that meets even the highest of standards.
There you go again. Well, I will say it's the next best thing to sipping a high-end bourbon. You'll step out of the shower feeling like a new man and like having a drink.
Well, I prefer to shower while sipping a good bourbon.
Oh.
Kidding, although I'm not opposed to the idea. And Cremo's scents are soothing like aromatherapy. For instance, after a really hot and sweaty day of yard work, and, well, a shower with Cremo right before bed had me feeling and smelling great and sleeping like a baby. And Cremo's body wash for men gets me clean, but also relaxes me after a long day, thanks to the rich scent of bourbon and vanilla that immediately fills the shower and my senses.
Well, I get it, because Cremo works with master perfumers to make sure that every Cremo body wash scent is meticulously blended and refined. And their hard work definitely shows. Every wash I've tried smells like a high-end cologne.
They do, but what I love about Cremo is that their innovative scents aren't perfumey or overpowering, which I don't care for. You come out bold and crisp, fresh and clean, feeling like $1 million.
Indeed. Well, I know we've recommended Cremo to our buddies before, but the new Bourbon Vanilla Men's Body Wash is excellent and absolutely worth trying out.
You've never smelled anything like Cremo's Bourbon Vanilla scent. Cremo also offers a wide range of other grooming products for men, including shave cream, beard oil, and shampoo, all in a variety of distinct masculine scents. Now, where can you find it?
You can find Cremo Men's Body Wash in its new distinctive Bourbon Vanilla scent at Walmart or Walmart.com.
Once again, that's at Walmart or Walmart.com.
This is Eric Jensen. Welcome back to the Astonishing Legends Maternity Ward, where zeitgeists are born. Now back to the show.
What gripped you? How did you first hear about this story? What got you motivated? Because it's no small feat or endeavor to decide you're going to travel to the area, take a lot of notes and interviews and research, pour over hundreds of articles perhaps, and write a book about it.
It's kind of a bit of a humorous story as to how this came about. I had released my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, which talked about the legend of Boggy Creek, famous Falk monster. And that came out in 2012. I mean, that was my first book, and I had no expectations or anything, but suddenly the response to that was very positive. I immediately got calls from TV and invited to speak at places. So I thought, okay, this is going pretty well. I think maybe I should write another book, and I'm thinking,
right, yeah.
Well, what is another creature that I I'm fascinated with and something that has substance or potentially. And I wasn't sure, but I like the kind of southern aspect of Boggy Creek. So I did what any other rational person would do. I set up myself to go on a swamp tour. And so I went around, mostly in the southeast, to a bunch of swamps, like swamps that had notorious things happen. And one of those, of course, Scape Ore Swamp outside of Bishopville. And I think this was sort of where I started with a book that I did later called Sinister Swamps. That was a much broader endeavor. One of the coolest stories I had ever heard was this lizard man out of Bishopville, because one of my favorite movies is The Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Right.
And this was sort of a modern day equivalent of something like that. I mean, literally real people saying they had seen something coming out of this swampy area that was very Creature from the Black Lagoon. So I really thought that was cool. And I didn't know there was enough for a book or not. And of course, I didn't know that till I show up, and I had called Sheriff Truesdale in advance and said, hey, if I come out there and do this, could I interview you, hang out or whatever? Oh, yeah, sure, So I went with one of my best friends. Her name is Cindy Lee, and she's in the book as well. She's done a lot of investigation with me. So we go out there, and I went to all these swamps like Okefenokee and Everglades and everywhere, which ended up in my later book. But I did all the research and stayed in Bishopville for a while, and Truesdale shared everything. I took a scanner and I scanned everything in that stack. I've got all those files.
Oh, that's cool.
And so while I was there in this cotton museum, which is there in Bishopville, they called the little local paper, the Lee County Observer, and somebody came down and interviewed me about my work and being a writer in cryptids. Well, when I got back home, somebody sent me this article that was on the front page of the newspaper that says, writer plans to write book on lizard man. Well, there it is.
I got to do it now.
And so I said, well, I do have enough here. And so I said, well, there's my second book. It's going to be only on lizard man, not other swamps, and the story of Truesdale, the town, the sightings, and all of that combined.
But how many books have you written since then?
I've written 8.
What was your latest one?
The latest one is Texas Bigfoot.
And people can find those at your website or on Amazon, right?
Correct. Yeah. I sell autographed copies, or you can get all of these on Amazon as well.
So what was going on with Tom and Mary Way and their car being mauled in July of 1988? Because just a few months ago, I feel like it was May or something, there was a couple of dogs that attacked a car, and they had it on camera because something had gone under the engine. It was fleeing them in the wheel well or something like that. Do you think maybe that was a situation like this, where it was like a predator-prey situation in that respect, or do you think it connects back to the lizard man?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that, the lizard man was the one that attacked the car, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was a strange, interconnected incidents. To me, I think the most logical conclusion about that, and probably mostly what the wildlife and game guys thought as well, is some cats or something had gone up into the engine area or had hid under the car or something like that, and that some kind of predator. The place where the Ways lived was literally on the edge of Scape Ore Swamp.
Okay.
And it's not very far outside of Bishopville, where it just sort of turns into country, and then you just have this lowlands with all the more remote areas of the swamp. And I think that some large animal tried to get at those cats for some reason, and that resulted in that car getting torn up. And it was confusing, though, because they could see footprints of what looked like maybe a fox, and there's a dog, and there's hair, all sorts of hair everywhere. And then the locals showed up, and the deputies were down there, and they found what looked like some larger human-like footprints. One guy says, well, maybe it's a bear. Somebody says they don't look like bear. So you had all that together, which sort of was the spark that set off the whole lizard man thing, or at least those stories coming out. But yeah, I'm not convinced that it was the lizard man who attacked that car.
The thing that struck me is with any of those animals, especially canines, there's a scrum, a kerfuffle. They're noisy. I would guess if it was some kind of pack of wild dogs, and especially if there was a bunch of cats there, as Tom and Mary Way claimed to have over 20 that were just kind of residing there near the house. It's like, you would hear a lot of barking, and I would think that that'd wake somebody up. Like the neighbors weren't woken. Tom and Mary were not woken up by this. It's something that seems silently just damage the car. Stuff happens in the middle of the night, of course, and people don't wake up depending, but it just seems unusual that nobody was alerted to what looked like a lot of damage in the middle of the night right next to the house.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the weird thing is you just can't quite line it all up because
Right.
yeah, you would think there's this enough of a scuffle to leave hair and all this other stuff. Why wouldn't they be awakened by this? So that's just a mystery as they just wake up and there's this car all torn up. So that, leaves it a little bit open as to, the possibilities that it wasn't just something that we can easily explain. If something went down and some animals were involved and something that was a resident of that swamp, Truesdale agreed with that. He didn't, he neither said, well, it definitely was a lizard man. He didn't say it wasn't. He and his deputies were almost just as confused. And that's why when the deputies went down there to respond to that call, they looked at all this and said, this is weird. So they called Sheriff Truesdale down there. So even the deputies who live in a rural community weren't even sure what it was.
Right. And these people have heard these animals. Scott and I have always talked about, even in LA, you'll hear coyotes in the middle of the night and they're yipping and making strange noises. Foxes do as well. A lot of people attribute paranormal sightings or sounds to foxes screaming like people might. And so there's a lot of noise that goes with these animals, but the evidence in a lot of these cases, and again, that wasn't, of course, as we've talked about, wasn't the only car damage incident to happen. There's been some other cases of physical traces left behind. What's the most compelling to you, other than the damage to these cars? What do you think is the most baffling thing that remains unexplained?
Just the anecdotal accounts in total, and a couple of them, I think, well, they didn't get a great look or a long look. And of course, everybody's talking about the lizard man. Maybe they, just thought, well, hey, we saw it. And that can happen because, everybody's on the lookout. But the ones that especially happened before Christopher Davis, though those stories didn't come out later because those witnesses just don't run to the police and said, I saw this upright weird thing in the swamp. George Plyler, that was like 86. He saw something. And then in 87, George Holloman. And these are guys that Truesdale knew. Frank Mitchell, who was the crop duster who saw something run across the runway. And I went to Frank Mitchell's house. I got to know this guy, and he's just a straight shooter. It's like, this isn't a guy looking for fame, or he's just a guy who saw something. And those are just, to me, just hard to explain. And then once you bring Christopher Davis into the mix, those sightings right there where nobody had lizard man on the brain or anything.
Right.
Those there was the only concept thereof was people in that Scape Ore Swamp area had been talking about seeing something. So I think there's people who had sightings that I could never find. And even Truesdale, they never came forward. So other people had seen it, and that's how Truesdale found out about it. And that's, to me, the hardest thing to explain.
All right, so one of the first things that I took from his book and also from talking to him just now was that Truesdale, the sheriff, was a legitimate cop and investigator, and he wanted to know what was going on, and he seemed to trust his instincts and his gut reaction to Christopher Davis's account, as well as the other people, where he seemed like he knows when somebody is fibbing and when something feels more real and when people are actually scared, and he wants to know what's going on, whether he believes in the supernatural or not. He's like, something is up here.
Yes, and also people have to get that image of the remember the movies from the 70s of somebody driving through a small country southern town and they get harassed by the sheriff who's just kind of a redneck with a gun and a bad attitude. No, the idea though, he really studied law enforcement and police forensic techniques and actually applied those professional techniques. He was a studied man and very, I think, objective, straightforward, not dismissive, and not bored by the job. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
There's
right.
no Barney Fife here. Well, actually, Barney would take it very seriously.
Yes, he
and
would.
Andy would have a very
seriously.
cautious, measured approach, but also respecting of the townspeople.
What about the Way case with the car that got, the 1985 Ford LTD? That's what they had that had just gotten mauled. By the way, I want to tell folks, I remember the 1985 Ford LTD. That thing is a tank. This was before cars had crumple zones or did anything to forgive an accident. And the fact that some animal managed to tear this car apart and do so much damage to it is pretty interesting, because you'd have a hard time doing damage to it with like a Sawzall.
Yeah, people have to realize the metal, automotive metal that they're used to now is so much more thin. If you worked with classic cars, worked on them, I've done a little bit of body work in the past, it's much thicker. It's not where you lean on it and it dents like today's cars.
You can tap dance on it and nothing
it's a tank.
Yeah.
So it's also puzzling to Sheriff Truesdale, who, by the way, Lyle compares him to Carl Kolchak, and I agree. He is, but not as bumbling. He's just somebody who's out to find an objective truth to all this.
For folks who haven't heard us talk about that before, that's a TV show called The Night Stalker, Kolchak's Night Stalker, which we've talked about a lot, and Richard Haddam is a huge fan of as well. So, well,
this incident you can easily dismiss as like just an animal attack or a pack of rogue dogs gotten out of their pen, and that certainly fits a mental image there. But what's unique about this instance here, I believe, is that you have a lot of after effects evidence, which you usually don't get. It's like, oh, here's kind of a muddy half print. Well, here's a lot of damage, but is it attributable to whatever this thing is, or is it just dogs? So as the story goes, this happened on the morning of July 14th, 1988. The Lee County Sheriff's Office, they got a weird call, a bizarre call. And this is a husband and wife, last name Way, W-A-Y-E. And they, had reported that their 1985 Ford LTD had been, in quotes here, mauled. Well, what does that mean? Well, sometime during the night while they slept, their vehicle here, as we described as a thick-skinned tank here, had been parked under an open metal carport. So picture that. And there's extensive damage now to the molding, the sidewalls, and the hood. And you could say also, like, well, that seems like the work of a vandal, just some kids screwing around here. But what was found also on this damage was hair and footprints around the car that led a lot of people to believe that some kind of animal may have been responsible. And that seems more likely here. But what kind of animal here would sink its teeth and claws, puncturing the metal? And there's pictures of, there's a CNN report, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And it looks like somebody punched big holes into this. It doesn't look like bite scratch marks that are kind of superficial, or somebody did this with their key. These are actual punched all the way through the metal, like a lion would do. So as they get there here, you got a lot of damage, scratched, dented, broken parts, motor wires had been ripped out. It looked like to them the car had been chewed. And then they find reddish color hair, and then there's muddy footprints all over the car. And this would, again, start to point to an animal theory of some kind. And they lived on the edge of Scape Ore Swamp. Lots of animals there. But not known, this swamp is, for animals to come out of it and attack cars. Then the deputies were kind of puzzled, and then they called the sheriff, Truesdale. And by the way, he'd been on the job, as they say, as the sheriff since 1974. So he's very well seasoned, knows the community backwards and forwards.
Yeah, that's 14 years he would have been.
Yeah, at this point here. And he believed the Ways were being truthful. And he also agreed it was probably an animal here. So a biologist is called in from South Carolina's Wildlife and Marine Resources Department. And the biologist studies the hair fibers and guesses, well, it could be from a red fox. But they also couldn't explain how such a small animal could create such damage.
Yeah, there's no way.
Yeah, just
when
mentally.
The fox idea came up, I was like, "There's no way a fox could do this to an LTD."
No, we're talking about puncture holes there. You're talking about, like I said,
maybe a moped. But not.
Well,
an
it's
LTD.
somebody with like an axe, an ice axe, or something like a pick, because the holes are round. They're about centimeter to like a quarter inch in diameter, like a line would punch through, perhaps. But well, they also had footprints to look at, not just the damage to the car. I think the muddy footprints on the car, like, okay, maybe that's a fox, but there were several other larger tracks that were found about 25 yards from the car heading back towards the swamp. That's kind of spooky. And they appeared to be from either a large biped or some kind of quadruped. Could be a bear, perhaps. Black bears were seen in Scape Ore Swamp before, and bears will do that. If there's food in there, they will chew through your car. They can rip the car door off. But what they're seeing here is evidence with the footprints. It's like a bear
Yeah.
could do that damage. The prints, the hair didn't seem like they were bear-like. So they just went with a fox. So the footprints on the car seem more likely from a fox, but not everyone agrees what those big tracks were that were leading away from the car back to the swamp. So we talked about local man James Knight, I think the carpenter here. So again, he was quoted as saying the tracks were aligned in a straight procession, typical of human steps. You know what I'm saying? So not like a big quadruped sprawled out. It's like a 2-footed human walking in a straight line back towards the swamp. So, okay, what do we have here logically? Well, as Lyle says in the book, it only leaves a few possible explanations. So, one, the car had been damaged during the night by human vandals, and they either left fox hairs or paw prints, perhaps, to throw them off the trail to their own hijinks, their shenanigans. Or the human vandals had been followed by maybe a curious animal who then jumps on the car, maybe chews up some of the attached molding that they had pried from the car in their vandalism, and that remains after the vandals flee. Or two, a fox, a bear, some other animal had actually damaged the car, maybe perhaps fighting each other, which would include crawling up into the engine area and or opening the hood to tear the wires, because remember also the engine wires, probably spark plug wires, were chewed out. But neither of these explanations makes much sense, as Lyle said, but that's all they had. Okay, so then the police show up, and of course, what happens in a small town? Neighbors start coming out of their houses. This is a lot like the Enfield Monster, and I would implore you to go back, listen to that episode, because, yeah, that's another state, but these things lay out kind of the same way. Also, people are going to say, like, well, it's mass hysteria. You know, the cards all fall the same way. It's like, no, well, not exactly, but there are patterns of how people react to this. And that's what our follow-up episode about that, you know, is it mass hysteria? It's like, well, no, it's more like social action in the way that was explained in that, I think Professor Miller had said that people behave in the same or similar ways, is that there's an incident, people come out to look, there's chatter, and people are hearing this police call on the scanners. People there like to know, you know, it's fun to hear what's going on there. And then a few reporters show up. So yeah, it's happening in the usual pattern here. And so Truesdale here, trying to disperse the crowd, create order. Also same thing in Enfield, is that's their job. We can't have too much of a disruption. Sure, it's fun, it's exciting. We need to get back to business. We need to get people back to their lives. So we need to solve this, figure it out, tell people, like, you don't have to worry, it was this or whatever. But then at that point, other locals start coming up to Sheriff Truesdale, telling him about their stories. So as what Lyle relays, while Sheriff Truesdale is looking over this, other community members start coming up to him and saying, like, yeah, we also saw a strange creature about 7 feet tall with red eyes. And then some of them described it as green, but others described it as brown. And they thought, like, well, maybe that's what happened to this car, whatever this thing is. So now you're getting other stories because you're asking people about them.
Right. And there's more coming out of the woodwork.
That's right. That's right. He's kind of opening the floodgates here.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this is that for Truesdale, there was a reporter with him at the time the original call came in named Jan Tootin. And Jan wrote for South Carolina's largest newspaper, The State.
Mm-hmm.
I guess she did a ride-along with him when he went out and started examining this stuff.
Yeah.
And somebody came up to the car while they were together named JJ. And Truesdale recalled saying to JJ, have you heard anything about a tall creature, possibly green with big red eyes? And JJ said, what do you mean, the lizard man? And that's how we first heard of it.
Yeah.
The lizard man. It was a simple name, and this is from Lyle's book. And so what happened was Jan took that, and that went into the press, went into the largest newspaper in the state, and that's how this thing became the lizard man, even though Christopher Davis, in his account, never used the word lizard man. He described lizard-like features, but he never said that it was a lizard man. So that's just how that started happening, which is the same thing we hear in all these kinds of stories. It's usually some reporter puts the label on it. Yeah. And in this case, it was a local, and then the reporter overheard it, and it went into the zeitgeist.
It's quick, it's colorful, it's easy to remember, but it also has to fit the general descriptions, for some anyway. You notice they didn't call it Mothman 2 or Mothman Jr. or some moth. It's like, well, some people described it as being scaly, green, dark, wet.
Right.
3 fingers, tall, reptilian-like. And so it has to fit that. But that's not every description, as we'll see. So speaking of that, let's get back to Lyle now. So we wanted to hear from him personally in greater detail since his last time on our show, what he thought about Christopher Davis's encounter with his cryptid, when he was changing his flat tire that night in 1988.
So, Lyle, one of the overall things that I got from this and the way that this story started to evolve with the veracity of the witnesses and all the different people starting to come forward is that it lines up a lot with the Mothman story. It's got a very similar kind of vibe on how that story spread and how many people had encounters. It's when those things are happening, you think, okay, well, there's much more to this than just, oh, this one incident and a bunch of people jumped on the bandwagon. But since you mentioned Chris, the original witness whose car broke down, whose story we've already told, but let's talk a little bit about him and his dad, Tommy. Tommy was somebody that was actually known to Sheriff Truesdale, right?
He knew him.
Yeah, okay.
As a community resident, yeah.
He felt like Tommy was a trustworthy person. He also felt that it seemed pretty clear that Chris definitely had some kind of frightening encounter, whatever happened. And so for Truesdale, that was part of what led him to believe there was something going on that was unusual in this situation then.
Right. Prior to Chris coming forward, the only mention Truesdale had heard was when he was down there investigating the car damage with the Waze. It's somebody came up and said, oh, maybe it was the lizard man. And Truesdale's like, what are you talking about? And they said, well, people have been seeing this brownish or greenish thing around here, and have been talking about it. And so that's when Truesdale said, well, if any of these people could come forward, they're not in trouble. I'd just like to learn more about this. Well, when Christopher Davis was brought in there with his dad, the credibility was immediate because these are people he knew, at least the father. And then by all accounts, Christopher was just an average kid. I mean, he was an honest kid. I mean, and I feel certain 100% something came after that kid. I mean, people talk of it being a farmer that chased him and all this other stuff.
Right, yeah.
But you also had this other guy claiming that he wore a mask in Scape Ore Swamp and he did it. I'm like, well, it can't be. There can't be two people down there. And if the farmer or if the guy in the mask was perpetrating this, boy, he was working hard because it's about 4 years worth of stuff to account for. So you're going to tell me that this person, guy from the Air Force Base, comes over here with a mask, he's doing it for 4 years? I think not. But essentially, something came after Christopher Davis, and I think, why would he make up a story? And the other thing is supposedly this farmer that owned this butterbean field, some air conditioners had been stolen, so he was sick of it and he was going to run people off. If a farmer chased Christopher Davis, I don't think he's going to run into his house and claimed he was chased by a monster. He wouldn't say nothing. He'd just be like, I got out of there. I'm not saying nothing. But he was so upset because he believed that whatever came after him was not human. And it was all the way up on his car. It wasn't like he saw it for 40 yards away even. It literally nearly jumped in the car. It was reaching for him and he drove away and the thing ran after him. This just doesn't sound like a farmer.
Okay, I'm just going to say, as a car nut, I remember the Celica of that year very, very well. But not a lot of handholds on the roof of that thing. There's not, and unless he had some kind of roof rack, I don't even know, because he said it was on the car while he was driving down the road. He saw the hands, right, or the whatever, like at the top of the windshield. No way anybody in a costume would be able to hang on to a car going 35 miles an hour down the road in the middle of the night. And then he's like, he wasn't sure when it had departed the car, but at some point it must have, but he didn't hear that or notice that when it flung whatever was up there off in the side of the road when he was trying to flee. Plus, you're going to get hurt pretty bad if you're a human in that situation. Sometimes you look at these stories and you think, oh, well, this person's just trying to get out of trouble. They did something generally irresponsible with something they don't own, or they were at work and they made a mistake. It's one of the prevailing theories behind this story, and this story may be apocryphal, about the train that hit the UFO, which is like the story where there's like a big dent in the front of the train, and they were like, oh, a UFO hit it, and maybe that's an engineer who didn't clear a water tower or something. In this case, it's his own car. He got a flat or whatever. He didn't steal his dad's car and take it joyriding or what. He just there's no reason for him to say, all of this happened to me as a cover for something else. There's no motivation there.
Right. And I mean, he was literally coming from his job. He worked at McDonald's in Bishopville and got off at 1 or 2 a.m. He worked a late shift, I guess, cleaned up. And the kid had money. I mean, he's also an honest kid. He's working a job. So
yeah,
this isn't a thief. And again, if you did try to steal something and a farmer came after you, I just don't see how he would come inside and have it in tears and scared to death.
Yeah.
To try to cover for something he was doing, because that's only going to create a problem. There's no good outcome from that. So if he tried to do something, it would have just been quiet. If he escaped the so-called farmer, it just doesn't add up. And in addition, Christopher Davis eventually took a lie detector test. He talked to Truesdale numerous times, and he was interviewed numerous times. He never changed the story. He passed the lie detector, all of it. And so, like I said, it just comes back to something weird happened to this guy, something that, by all accounts, was not a human, chased him out of Scape Ore Swamp.
There's a fundamental difference when it comes to that theory of the farmer and the gear that kept getting stolen, so he's out there on guard or whatever. There is a fundamental difference between somebody who is working a closing shift at McDonald's and somebody who is an opportunist who steals stuff off of a farm when nobody's looking. Those two personalities don't meet each other very often. You're working the late shift at McDonald's. You are willing to be, as you said, find honest work and do what you need to do to make a living. That's a different thing from cruising around in the middle of the night trying to steal farm equipment, which, by the way, you can't get much in a Celica either. Going back to the car thing, it's not going to hold a whole lot.
Where is he going to put the thing anyway? So
yeah, exactly.
A lot of these anecdotes fit the ongoing tropes of somebody in the car or somebody just outside the car seeing something. They get in the car in the nick of time, then they get chased. We started discovering these kind of stories with Skinwalker Ranch and some of the local indigenous people claiming that they had a run-in. This thing was keeping up with their car at 60 miles an hour, side by side, was trying to get in. And I would say the ones which are just the kind of the sightings, like we just saw this thing, we drove by, this thing was crouching down. It looked like it was 7 feet tall, log arms that were swinging, red eyes, this and that. Like, that's just about enough to be in that the Goldilocks zone of believability, where there's more than just, I saw this shape that seemed hairy and that was it. I don't know what it was, because that's not enough to tell people about it. But then you look at Kenneth Orr's account where it's like, okay, then it's a little too much. Like he shoots it, it gets away, it's doing this and that. You look at the guy's personal effects and it's like, they're a little eccentric. And then you start to cast doubt on what he was doing. It's like the photo is too clear or the photo is too blurry. Where you have these accounts, though, they do seem to line up with a lot of people's strange encounters, because it's not too much, but it's more than just like, I saw this shape.
So it was my grandmother's 96th birthday the other day.
Wow. Was there a shindig or something?
Well, she's in assisted living, so the whole family went over for a party in the courtyard there at her facility. It was pretty great. She may be 96, but she's sharp as a tack for her age.
That's pretty amazing.
I'll tell you what, though, I have some other relatives who were there who shall remain unnamed, who just have absolutely no filter on the personal questions they'll ask you. And then they don't even really listen to the answers either.
Oh, no. I know. I can't stand that.
Yeah, I find myself just kind of making stuff up to get through the conversation quickly and move on without divulging any personal information, because you know for sure that info is not going to be safe with Aunt Linda.
No, it's not. And I don't even know Aunt Linda.
Well, that's how you have to be with certain family members sometimes. But you shouldn't feel that way when you're talking to your doctor. Whether you're confessing your dedication to couch potato hours or confessing how much pizza you had last week. And that's where ZocDoc comes in.
Yes, ZocDoc is the place where you can find and book doctors who will make you feel comfortable and actually listen to you.
And that's right. And we're not talking about a handful of doctors here. We're talking about tens of thousands, all with verified patient reviews, so you can make sure the vibes are vibing before you ever meet IRL. With ZocDoc, you've got more options than you can imagine.
ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare highly rated in-network doctors near you and instantly book appointments with them online.
Yeah, once you find a doc you want, you can book them immediately. You don't have to call a phone tree and go through 15 menus with an AI that keeps asking you the same questions over and over. And like we said, these docs all have verified reviews from actual real patients.
We're talking about booking appointments with tens of thousands of top-rated, patient-reviewed, credible specialists. You can filter specifically for ones who take your insurance, are located near you, and treat basically any condition you're searching for.
The typical wait time to see a doctor booked on ZocDoc is between just 24 and 72 hours. That's it. You can even score same-day appointments.
Hey, we use this, and you should too.
Go to ZocDoc.com/legends and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today.
That's ZocDoc.com/legends. ZocDoc.com/legends. This podcast is brought to you by Squarespace. And I know we were talking about Rich Haddon purveying his purportedly paranormal bookshelf, and that, of course, his Squarespace website has everything he needs as a content creator and has everything his listeners need. But I was thinking about something you mentioned last time. What if he was also offering the Richard Haddon screenwriting or creative writing course?
Oh, yeah. I was just spitballing, but that would be a great offering. And as you know, so many of our listeners have mad skills and talents they could be teaching.
Right.
There are artists, musicians, craft makers, chefs and bakers, so many professionals and creators with hidden talents. Well, why not have a side gig selling courses on that you're good at?
Exactly. You'll feel good sharing your gifts, and why not make a little money doing it? So, if you're thinking about creating and selling your own online course, Squarespace has all the tools you need. You start off by choosing a layout that fits your brand. Then upload videos of you doing your thing, and then you can customize everything with next-generation editing technology. Create those engaging lessons you know your audience will love, and then add a paywall and set the price. You can charge a one-time fee or sell subscriptions. Take what you know and turn it into income with Squarespace courses.
Man, that's a great idea. Once you create your courses, or really any exclusive content you create, like your products, recipes, music, writing, or artwork, you add that paywall and then you can sell memberships or your courses. Or you can just sell your content or files like how-to instruction manuals in the form of PDFs, ebooks, or video or audio your customers can download.
Yeah, but what if you're not a great writer like Rich, and you say you can't even write a decent product description or marketing email? Well, Squarespace AI can help with that. Kickstart or update written content on any website, product description, or email with Squarespace AI, generating instant, personalized results that know and show your brand identity. Explain what your site is all about, choose your tone, and enter what you need to get short or long-form text. No matter the placement, Squarespace AI makes it easier to go live, stand out, and succeed online.
Start sharing your gifts and get some gifts in return. You'll never know unless you start trying. And all you need to do to start is go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/legends or use code LEGENDS to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
That's squarespace.com/legends and promo code LEGENDS.
Forrest and Scott, thank you for supporting their sponsors. I'm Summer. Now back to the show.
Well, Lyle touched on a lot of interesting things here. One is the story that there was this angry farmer who was mad about air conditioners or something, if I recall, being pinched off his farm all the time. Yeah, he's out there standing guard or ready to confront anyone who came by, but that just doesn't measure up to Christopher's report at all. So why would he say anything to anyone if he was trying to steal something? And what farmer would jump on the roof of his car as he was driving away in a costume? It doesn't make sense.
He's wearing burlap bags or something, or just something maybe to frighten people, or
like the Sandman from Nightmare Before Christmas. Right?
Well, exactly. Something just to kind of scare people, or just, it's just kind of a cheeky kind of thing. But he was genuinely upset about the theft of his air conditioners. Yeah. However, I will say what's become known as the butter bean shed incident.
Yes.
This is an easy way also for people to say, well, there you go. That explains everything. Angry farmer out there. He confronts this guy. It's around his area. Case closed. But so often, most of the time, these things don't add up. This story can get picked apart. Yeah, it kind of fits some of that, but it really is that square peg into the round hole for explanations.
What farmer can run 35 or 40 miles? What human runs 35 or 40 miles an hour?
Well,
of course, then you say, oh, well, Christopher was exaggerating about how fast he was going. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
Still, let's take what farmer runs, I don't know, 8 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour, which, the car with him slamming on the gas and being paranoid, there's no way it's going that slow. So,
well, no, but let's look at the gentleman himself. I love this character, though. I mean, he's a real guy, and he was well liked and respected in the community as well. And so people took his word for it. But his name is Luscious, his first name, nickname Brother, last name Elmore. So he went by Brother Elmore, or just Brother, but real name Luscious Elmore. But he had reported chasing a person, which kind of fit Chris's description from his farm. And he would say that would have happened in late June. However, he claimed this at first, but then he later denied it.
Yeah.
Brother Elmore said, well, nah, I didn't really chase a guy. Maybe he saw somebody. So even he's saying, for whatever reason, he didn't do this.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to add is that when Tommy, Christopher's dad, came out and checked on the car, he found that the driver's side mirror was bent and twisted, and the paint on the roof had scratches on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a confirmation from his dad that something definitely was on the roof at some point. And Sheriff Truesdale felt that Tommy was a trustworthy source. He had worked for years as head of an electrical department at a large plant in Sumter, and he was a well-respected community member. Truesdale also felt Chris was being truthful during the police interview. And he was like, I don't know. I don't know what he saw. I think he saw something out of this world. I don't know what it was, but I believe him. So here's the other thing. Chris said he had heard stories about a weird creature going back at least 2 years prior, but hadn't given it much thought. You know, they told him, as we said, he hadn't been drinking. He was coming from work at McDonald's, and he never claimed it was a lizard man. He actually thought maybe it could have been a bear with wet green mud on its fur, but that it just didn't seem like the actions of a bear, whatever it was. He was just, it was like something he'd never seen, strange and frightening. Truesdale actually had him tell this story a second time on tape. We did ask Lyle if he had that, and he said Truesdale did not have that tape. But what Truesdale did say was that the second time the story was exactly the same as the first time, which is, classic investigative technique. It's like, does the story change? And Truesdale said, no, it didn't. What he told me matched what he told me the first time, the same thing he said on tape. And then also there's that sketch, which we have a picture of in the on the webpage for this episode, where he drew like a humanoid creature with 3 fingers on each hand. One thing I wondered about that, Forrest, was like whether it had 3 fingers or not, or it just those were the only fingers that he saw. Maybe it had 5 and their other 2 were shorter or something like that. I don't know.
Perhaps. He got a good look at it because, as he said, they were hanging down from the roof of the car next to the windshield. So he got a very close-up look at whatever it was. And yeah, there could be a lot of misidentification here or just misremembering what he did see. But according to his dad, he was shook up enough that when he ran into the house, he was, breathless, and he just started crying. He was so upset and generally taken, as the story said, as a quiet, honest, earnest young man. Yeah. And then Truesdale believed him. He said, well, would you both agree to take a lie detector test? And they both agreed they would do that. So then he says, okay, well, you're dismissed for now. And then he'll be in contact once he gets that all arranged and gets a polygraph set up.
All right. So in this next segment, we asked Lyle about stories of folks actually being physically attacked.
Have you come across any other cryptid encounters where the person was attacked or claimed some physical altercation with something and lived to tell about it, where that's the next level where it seems like, okay, now that seems a little more implausible because I got some scratches and they were from a Bigfoot or a lizard man or this and that?
They're not frequent, but I do get reports or run across something I read where somebody was attacked. There's one I've written about in my Beyond Boggy Creek book where I talk about southern Sasquatch. There was a case from Texas, a place called Crook Lake. And the woman says her and her husband were driving out there one evening. It's kind of a remote lake here in northeast Texas. And they had a flat tire. And this was not before cell phones, but they didn't have cell phones, so the husband had to set off walking back to the town, which was nearby, to get a replacement tire or a tow truck or something. I mean, they were just stuck out there, really. And so she stays in the car and she's enjoying the evening. She's in there hanging out and she hears these strange howl come out of the woods, which was pretty eerie. And it's starting to get towards dusk, it was late evening. And, she hears that and just sort of, you kind of dismiss it or talk yourself out of it. And hey, I'm in the cab of the truck anyway, so what's the worry? But it's hot in Texas. Usually, most times, it could be year round. So you got the windows down. And she was kind of dozing off. And she said all of a sudden she was awakened and noticed 3 tall, upright, hair-covered figures walking towards the truck from the woods. And she said it looked like, a larger one and 2 smaller ones. And before she really could process what she was looking at, the larger one runs up to the window of the driver's side door and tries to start. She reaches in there and tries to grab her. And at this point, she sees it's this kind of feral looking, ape-like, Bigfoot looking thing that looks strong and powerful, and its arm is coming in there, and she, scampers to the other side of the cab, and it's reaching for her. She didn't have the window all the way down, so it can't quite get its whole shoulder in there. And she said as it reached for her, she grabbed a Coke bottle, which was on the floor of the truck, and just started hitting this thing, and it pulled its arm out, and they'd howled or something, and these figures eventually just ran back into the woods. And she, in the process, this thing had scratched her on the legs. And she actually, when the husband got back and the whole thing, at some point there later that night, she went into the ER and was treated for these scratches. So that's the story. And that was one that the witnesses were interviewed by multiple colleagues of mine as well. But it's got a lot of the same similarities in a way.
They're always reaching for you. Do you think they intend harm? What's the purpose here of chasing the car, getting on the roof? I guess you could look at that from a zoological or animal behavior perspective, is that, most animals, look, a bear will get into your car if it smells food and just tear up the whole thing and leave you with a nasty mess. But these creatures see the people. There's some kind of recognition from being to being, and then they charge the car and they try to get on top of it. What's the purpose of that?
Well, I think in a way, if they really wanted to harm, for example, the lady at Crook Lake in Texas, if it really wanted to get in there, I suppose it could have tried to break the window out or something. These are rather strong. Just imagine if say a chimpanzee or a gorilla was trying to get in your car. You better have the window rolled up. I don't know what the end game is there, why they're trying to do that. It could be a combination of curiosity. She may have perceived it as an attack. It could have just been trying to reach in there. And also, just like you mentioned with bears, if you park out in an area where there's bears and you got food in your car, they're trying to get in there. Maybe she had a Coke bottle, maybe there was remnants of food, or was trying to get in there for food, or it may have not realized it could break the window. Presuming they don't understand what a clear window that's breakable. So, but with Christopher Davis, obviously that whatever that was seemed hell bent on getting him, and if he would have not escaped in the nick of time, what would have happened? So, and maybe there is cases where people disappear, or, it was mauled by a bear or this or that, when actually it could have been something that we don't understand, and it was just pegged as something we do understand. So who knows what the end game is, but I think in a way, if they wanted to get us, they probably could.
Yeah. Well, you go back to the Patterson-Gimlin film and Patty, they see us, they acknowledge us, but really don't want to have anything to do with us and just kind of saunter off. And some of these sightings that you've mentioned, especially in their book with other creatures, that they see us and then they really want to get away. With the frogman, the Loveland frogman, they seem to have another purpose where they have a mission to accomplish, that they're doing something else, and a witness happens upon them. And another scenario is that they see you and they're agitated. And it could be, again, if you're going to go as an animalistic instinct, it's that they're territorial, like they want you out of there. They want to scare you. They want you gone. What's the point of the actions that are going on here? So I think you're right. I think sometimes it just could be interpreted as clumsy, and they're behaving in ways that we're trying to make sense of, but we don't know how they think. This seems kind of unpredictable, I guess is what I'm saying, is that trying to jump on top of your car as a response, but when you look at other cryptids, that always seems to be the case, that there's scratches, there's some kind of swoop, like, Mothman, like just swooping down. Mothman's like, wait, I want to talk to you. Let me swoop down and scratch your car. There's only really a couple of reasons that a wild animal, and at least from the animal kingdom that we know, would do something like that. Aggression, hunger, The last one that you really don't want to be on this list is sex. I guess, so the question is, that's like with the lizard man. It's like, as you said, this is my territory. Get out of here. I'm going to attack you. I have children nearby. Maybe you don't know. My kids are right over here in the butterbean field or whatever. And then the other thing is, is aggression, which is combined with the territoriality. It's like, this is my spot. Don't come around here. I don't care if you have a road and a machine or whatever. Don't come over here. This is where I live. There's that aspect to it. And you have to think about if these cryptids that have like heightened senses of survival and are more in tune with the environment than we are and are riding along in our automobiles and are comfortable getting from our, late night McDonald's jobs to our homes or whatever, they are more able to hide from us and to stalk us and to do these things that we're not going to be in tune with, and, unless we're special forces or something like that. So it's interesting what you're saying about the aggression and the territoriality, which I think tracks with the whole like attacking the car or whatever, or protection of your young.
Well, if you look at it also, if you want to take an interdimensional spin on this, and that if these things are popping up, we covered the mantis men a little while back, and in some of those cases, they seem to be just as surprised. There's a little more sentience going on in those encounters where there's a mind meld between them, perhaps, and the person viewing them unexpectedly. And what's often described is that they're both shocked. Both the human and the creature are both surprised, like either I'm not supposed to be here, or you're not supposed to be here, or you're not supposed to see me. And there's a look of surprise. So I'm wondering what these creatures that seem to be maybe lower level, no shade on them.
No offense to lizard man.
But when you look at these creatures, do you think that if they just pop into our existence, or they get surprised that maybe they're just reacting out of fear and defensiveness as well? Does that make sense to you?
The chance encounter goes both ways. It's
right.
It's like maybe, it's like a bear. I mean, you see I've seen a bear in the wild. It just sauntered by. But if that bear had cubs, it might have just come right at me. I mean,
right.
So it's circumstances we don't really know, because even Christopher Davis couldn't know. All he knows is that something on two legs came at him, and whether it had young or it had a bad day or anything else, it just, that chance encounter sparked that reaction. And you're right, Scott, animals are pretty predictable in 3 or 4 ways. It's only one of those, was it? Mm-hmm. Well, we should add in this. Christopher Davis, according to the account, he had a leftover fish fillet sandwich.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I mean, fish, we're talking about a
lizard man, fish, swamp. It's in the food chain. It's in the food group for him.
It smells good. It's what he would go for. So again, a bear, even a hog, we have feral hogs, I come up on hogs 100 yards away. And when the wind shifts, they can sense and they run off. Right. They smell it. So something could smell a fish fillet sandwich, I would imagine, for a good distance. So,
especially while you're dealing with a flat tire. I wanted to ask a little bit about Deputy Atkinson and State Trooper Hodge and that encounter with Rodney Nolf and Shane Stokes. They said they saw this large muscular animal moving on 2 legs, and then they went back to investigate, and they found the 40-gallon drums, which is really interesting. They're all crushed. And then the tracks. I love that you scanned all that stuff, so you must have seen everything. It's like, are those tracks, as you said yourself in the book, and everyone seems to agree, are all kind of perfect looking? They don't look biological. They look like a track that somebody would make. Are there tracks that are more biological in appearance than the ones that are in the plaster casts that are, I know, at least in one picture in your book?
I haven't seen any that were collected at the time, and Sheriff Truesdale didn't have any photos or anything of other suspected tracks that looked better. And, of course, those tracks look flat out hokey.
Yeah.
And, they're part of the story, certainly. And
it reminded me of the footprint that Dino leaves in the Flintstones. Like,
it just, but, just because one thing, you can't throw out that old saying, the baby with the bathwater or whatever. You can just, because some jokers may have added to this, doesn't mean that Christopher Davis didn't see something, that George Plyler didn't, that it's not connected. You can have, when you get a lot of publicity, and I've seen this in other cases, there'll be a few jokers that try to add to it, which makes it a little confusing, but we have to be able to rule out you have to be balanced enough and skeptical enough to say, okay, well, that seems stupid, but this other stuff does not. And that doesn't mean that they are even connected. It's just part of the story.
What did Truesdale think, and what do you think about when those tracking dogs came in and couldn't pick up a scent? You know, it was mentioned, it's like, oh, well, it's not a known animal or a known creature, but like even if it was a human in a costume or something else, a dog would still get a scent, right?
Right. The weird part of the tracks. And so that same night when Rodney and Shane came into the deputy's office late and said they had seen some big creature run across the road, that's the one where I'm like, they didn't get a great look. Then the lady called and said she heard weird howls, and those deputies, given everything going on, they drove down there, and they, according to them, and this is Truesdale telling me, they went down this dirt road towards the lady's house, and they turned and went, down to dead end when they came back, and that's when they saw the footprints. So number one, they felt that they would have seen those prints because it wasn't just one. It was all the way across the road and going in the woods. They felt like those prints were left in the time that they, drove the road and turned around. Then the prints were there. Then the next day when they brought those dogs down there, the other weird thing is they seemed spooked and wouldn't go into the woods. So
So it wasn't necessarily even that the dog couldn't get a scent. It was that I'm not doing this kind of situation from the dog.
Yeah, one or the other. They just wouldn't do it. And trained bloodhounds like that don't typically, they will perform their job. That is what they do. And it wouldn't be hard. Like say that was a bear that went across the road or whatever, or a bobcat. They could follow those tracks, no problem at all. But for whatever reason, they didn't do it. And so that adds that other, just everything is always this conundrum of bizarreness where you almost can say, well, those are fakes, but what about the deputies who said these things just appeared in that short a time? I don't know. How could somebody have done that?
All of these things that seem designed to make you feel incredibly intrigued and foolish at the same time. It seems like there's a lot of stories that have all of those elements to them.
That's true. And the other thing is that no one ever came forward claiming responsibility for those tracks. I don't think you're going to get in big trouble. Maybe they thought they would and they never said anything. But whereas some cases you get people trying to admit to hoax or claim their handiwork, nobody ever came forward and said, oh yeah, we made those, in all of these years that, to my knowledge, and I probably would have gotten wind of it, but nobody in Truesdale, I'm discussing it with him in his living room. He's like, I don't think he was quite convinced those were lizard man tracks, but he was baffled at how they were done and why nobody had ever claimed credit.
Add to that, okay, there's some great tracks. There's got to be some scent here, but there's a rain that night. Washes everything away. Or it's some other story where we took photos, but it's the Carl Kolchak thing. It's like, I took a bunch of great photos with my Kodak Instamatic 126 and then the film gets exposed. It's like, there's always something that foils better proof. And this case is no different, it seems, in that there's scratches, but they're kind of tiny scratches. And that, it could have been large jawed dogs, even domesticated ones. Somebody's dogs got out of the yard and attacked this thing, but they punched holes in thick metal in kind of seemingly uncharacteristic patterns down the seam of a car fender or hood and left some blood doing it. It's like, that seems a little bit much. It's a little farther out of the reach of a fox or a coyote. Yeah, okay, perhaps, again, a bigger dog, but is that characteristic? It's like, okay, so that's some evidence left, but again, the part that foils that is that the more mundane hairs and blood left behind that kind of point to some more explainable creatures, but for some very unexplainable or inexplicable actions, what you're left with, I guess, is what I'm getting at, is mostly just the people's accounts. And again, this is a little earlier, so there's no cell phone footage. You get some very good videos nowadays, but even then, that's not always totally believed. There's always something that's wrong about the evidence. It's always just out of reach.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just, we had just a little bit more or just a little clearer photo, but it almost seems like, it just suspends that mystery. It just keeps the mystery open. And certainly the lizard man case, just like you say, you can kind of explain some of it, but you can never explain all of it.
Right.
Every little bit of this. And the thing is, it's like it does have those tropes. You know, he barely escaped, or the rain. It literally rained the next day after those tracks. But this isn't it's not fiction, because I heard that story in description straight from Truesdale. He said, and he remembered quite well, because he's like, people from People magazine were trying to come down there, and he was trying to keep everybody out. They're trying to interview him, all this weird stuff going on. They were down there casting the tracks as fast as they could, and here comes the rainstorm. I mean, you know, he's not familiar with tropes or anything like we may be. It's like,
right.
He's just saying, well, this is what happened. So
raining. It's South Carolina. It rains. It's a swamp. It's like,
so you have all these things, but this is actually what happened. This is real life, and people saw unexplained creatures. So yeah, it's always just one small thing from being able to either prove it or refute it or whatever, but it just is that mystery that just keeps going.
There's a lot of things that keep popping up here in this description. You do talk about in the book about, 3 fingers versus 5, or the different types of eyes, or the common height of 7 feet tall. People saying like, well, this thing was kind of more green and shiny and scaly, or no, this thing was more brown and kind of matted or had hair. Could you talk about the evidence purported by people and why it varies? Because when I look at it, it's like, yeah, that maybe casts some doubt on all their descriptions, because they don't really match up, or they're described differently. But in the general, if you look at a lot of other lizard people sightings, or more bipedal mammal type creatures here, humanoids, that there's a lot of commonalities. And what's going on? What are some of the generalities that we're seeing here, in the differences, and why they may be pointing to misidentification, or maybe this is just part of the package you get with these kind of sightings?
It is kind of what you encounter, where you have a small area where you have multiple witnesses. You still get these discrepancies in the description. You'll find some generalities. And in this case, I think it makes enough sense, brownish or green. I mean, it depends on the lighting. It depends on, the conditions. Something that you see as a silhouette in darkness, it was black, well, if you had full light on the thing, well, it's actually brown, and the height, I think, was fairly consistent in that it was human size or larger. And you get this whole 3-fingered thing, which is always, again, sort of a typical monster thing, to have 3 toes and 3 fingers. Christopher Davis, he said that, and he had a drawing. He drew a drawing of the creature, and that's what he drew. But not everybody saw the hands. Not all, you don't have all that detail in everybody's. Or the guy said they saw a muscular creature, or the crop duster Frank Mitchell said he saw it looked ape-like when it was going across its runway. And some of the later sightings, which the Blyther family, I really like that one, because he had all of them come in and write down what they saw. And I have the handwritten documents. I included some of that in the book. I mean, I literally have their handwriting, which was only a day or 2 after the incident. And one of them just flat out said, I think it looked like a Sasquatch. So they're, okay, well, is it a Bigfoot? Is it a reptilian? What is it? But I think conditions, and that you see these things very fast. I've been a hunter all my life, and I've seen animals in the woods under all kinds of conditions, and there are a lot of factors, and and also the people are scared, so it doesn't necessarily blow the case if there's discrepancies in the witness statements, because this isn't a zoo. They're not sitting there like, okay, observe it for 10 minutes and write down your thoughts. It's very quick. And I've seen stuff, that was so fast I couldn't take a picture, and it was so weird that I'm just kind of baffled by it. We just don't have enough data to really say what exactly it looked like. And
Micah Hanks was on a while back, and he did a show that we called The Search for Man-Like Monsters in History, or I think that was his title for it. And he was just talking about the prevalence of Sasquatch and Bigfoot throughout human history, going way, way back. but that it hadn't been culturally connected because there were different terms or different perceptions of it. And ever since he came on and did that episode with us, I think about that now whenever there's a story like this, where it's like, well, it had fur, no, it was a lizard, it had a human face, it had eye shine, it had all of these different things. And like you said, people are seeing in the dark. How stressed out are they? Some people are probably in a hot panic. Others are more collected. And they're trying to put all these things together. And then, of course, once that the idea of the lizard thing gets into the local zeitgeist and into the local culture, they're just like, oh, it's the lizard. I saw the lizard man. And somebody might even say that and being like, well, it looked like a Bigfoot, but it was the lizard man because that's what everyone's talking about or whatever. And so then that clouds the perception and all the reports and everything and makes it harder to figure it out. And then because of these disconnections in the semantics and what are we going to call this and how are we really describing it? Which is why the sketches, like what Chris drew, or like if you could just get like a court sketch artist in to talk to everybody and be like, just what did you really see exactly? Let's get more specific on this. And this idea, because then the next thought that you have, and it's something that I think that Forrest had mentioned in the outline, it's like, well, maybe it's a shapeshifter. Maybe it can appear however it wants. It was like, then when you start tipping over to the real paranormal, I mean, Lyle, where do you come down on on cryptids versus paranormal cryptids? Or you're like, no, Bigfoot is just an extant ape, unknown thing, or no, I'll give it a chance of popping into here from another dimension, or it's got some other kind of a predator power. What is your stance on that kind of thing?
So for me, I mean, growing up hunting and being sort of this, I wanted to be Tarzan or whatever. I've always had that romantic view of cryptids as these are just, they're there in the woods and I can find them if I look and I go out and I, just as much as I might see a cougar or a bear, I might see this rare species of ape that's out here. It's the best explanation I got and that's cool. But for me, but yes, I mean, it all of this defies that simple explanation. And if we want to go into paranormal, you start getting into Mothman and even Lizard Man. These things don't add up as simply as Bigfoot might. So I keep an open mind. And it's cool. And, if they are paranormal entities, oh man, what are my chances of ever encountering one of these or capturing it or whatever,
Yeah.
They're out the door, but
Yeah.
so be it. There's still spooky things that people see. And I'd like to point out a little bit more about what we talked about is it's perception about people calling these different names. I always use the example of if you were born and raised in southern Louisiana and your grandmother talked about rougarou in the woods, you don't go out there as a rougarou, and you see a big, tall, hairy, bipedal, upright thing, and you don't get a very good look at it, you're going to come and say, I think I saw a rougarou once.
Right.
If you were in the Pacific Northwest, your grandmother talked about how your uncle saw one of these Sasquatch once. You see a big old hairy thing briefly in the woods. You saw a Sasquatch.
Right.
It's hard.
Exactly.
Your cultural perception will influence this. And exactly like Scott said, once people started calling it the lizard man, and that was the perception, the witnesses got, then everything after that is the lizard man. And that's just your localized name. Even though, yeah, I mean, it may not be a creature from the Black Lagoon. It might have been a Bigfoot covered in algae or wet. And under those circumstances, it looked more weird, scaly, reptilian.
As you say in the book, that's another level. We've talked about levels of belief. I go on and on about this, as listeners know, in that the level of belief is that, I saw some unidentified aerial phenomenon or a UFO as a craft or a set of lights or this and that, a triangle, whatever it is. Like, that's a solid object, but it's another level to believe that there's something in them flying around or some other intelligence and they're manipulating us. And it's scary to think that we have no control over that. They're going to do what they want to do and take some of us, and we're not going to have a good time. And that's another level of belief of somebody coming forward with a story like that. And like, yeah, I know this person's kind of a kook. It's like, I'm not going there. In this case, though, I totally agree with this, is that Bigfoot as a large simian, bipedal, whatever it is, more human-like, though, than our ape-like orangutan cousins, perhaps, in that, okay, that's more believable. I'll accept that. That's a big of a stretch, that there's something that's more human-like, but it's more animal-like, where here it's like, okay, something that's half human, half lizard, something that's humanoid, nah, that's too far out because it's too far down an imaginary evolutionary scale for us to kind of grasp, and also too frightening, perhaps. So that leads to my next question here. One of the big ones that I brought up at the beginning here is that, okay, what do you think is being seen here? Is it one creature that's being misidentified by different people depending on the conditions, or are there several different types of creatures being seen?
If I look at the data and the descriptions and what there is of it, I think it was multiple creatures, because you have some really good perceptions. The Blythers, who was, a family, it was more than one witness who saw it at the same time, and they all kind of leaned towards it, looked like it had hair, was brown. One of them said it looked like a Sasquatch. I call that a really good Bigfoot, where the sheriff had these people write down what they saw at the police station. But you go to Christopher Davis, he saw it close enough, and something happened to that kid, and he didn't describe it like that, and neither did some of the previous guys. So I think you almost have a mix, and you do have a history of Bigfoot sightings in South Carolina, and you've got the Lizard Man case, and it's a remote sort of swampy area. Who's to say different people didn't see different things? And some of those could be chalked up to mistaken identity. They did have Lizard Man on the brain, but just because somebody had a mistaken sighting doesn't rule out the other one. So I think it's a combination that just sort of was like the perfect vortex of monster media sensation and monster coolness, where people were seeing weird stuff that they felt that they could now report. Because see, people could have seen a Bigfoot there in the past. They're not going to run to the newspaper, but now we're talking about Lizard Man. I saw some weird thing, and well, this is what I'm describing it as. So all this stuff was documented and investigated. Right. So multiple phenomenon created this just really enduring legacy of the Lizard Man.
Well, that's what I think adds a little bit of not only interest, but maybe some credibility to these reports, because as you were saying, people would say, oh, well, once somebody said Lizard Man, that's it. Everybody's seeing a Lizard Man. Every description is going to be perhaps what Chris is going after. As he said, he saw hands, rough-looking black-fingernailed hands sticking down from the windshield, red-eyed devil, 7 feet tall, 3 fingers, all these kind of things. If people are going to imagine that, it's like, well, they're just going off that or what they heard, or that's what Chris heard, even though there were sightings before, a couple years before him, that they're all going to be roughly the same. But they aren't, in the fact here that they vary differently. Like, yeah, it was a Lizard Man, but it had a tail. Or it didn't. Yeah, it was a Lizard Man, but it didn't have a tail.
But a lot of them, too, that don't line up are bipedal. A lot of them, even when there's visual descriptions that vary between the face or whatever, it's something running on 2 legs, right?
Right. Yes, that would be the common denominator. It was always bipedal.
I'm Sprinkleface, and this is Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
All right, let's take a second to go into more detail on Rodney Nolf and Shane Stokes, because this is an interesting story. So July 24th, around 2 a.m., 2 teens, Rodney Nolf, Shane Stokes, come into the Lee County Sheriff's Office, frantic and telling an officer they thought they saw the Lizard Man. They're driving along Highway 15 with their girlfriends when something they described as a large muscular animal moving on 2 legs darted out in front of them. They only caught a glimpse of the beast before it leapt a tall fence and darted into the woods. Deputy Wayne Atkinson thought the boys were shaken up and scared enough that their story was truthful, although he wasn't sure what they saw, telling the Item, which is that paper that Jan Tootin worked for, right. Telling their reporters, I've been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone's scared. A few hours later, same night, a woman called the station with a report that she had heard strange howls coming from the woods. Now, given this earlier sighting, Deputy Atkinson and State Trooper Mike Hodge decided to patrol the back roads with a spotlight. While on Bramlett Road, they discovered several 40-gallon drums that had been crushed and scattered along the road with other debris. They couldn't figure out why the drums were crushed or how and why they were in the road. They also found several tree limbs overhead about 9 feet up that had been snapped. And then they got the feeling that something was watching them from the woods. Mm-hmm. So people are getting freaked out. But these are two, as you like to say, Forrest, trained observers. They're out there trying to figure out what's going on.
I do say it a lot, but I first heard that, yes, when I was in traffic court.
Oh, okay.
It's like, well, what about my opinion? Like, yes, but the police officer here, he's a trained observer.
He's a trained observer. He knows how many miles per hour you were going.
Exactly. That's just even gauging that. Like, well, I think I was going the speed limit. Like, nah, he didn't think so.
Right.
Even the average person will take their word over just some Joe.
Yeah.
And not that they never lie or they never, they can't misidentify something either, but you have two officers now that are seeing something it's a strange scene here. And people who have been watched from the woods know what that feeling is like. I think that's what's being described here, is that that paranormal feeling of being watched from the woods, because it's a small town. Like, this isn't, I'd say, well, it wasn't a paranormal hotspot before all this, but it did have strange things going on throughout the years, but nothing major, I would say.
Right.
And so it's not like these guys are easily freaked out, or just like four young kids in a pickup with guns freaking themselves out and each other. So they get out of the car and then they see a huge set of animal tracks, nothing like they'd ever seen before. To their description, the impressions had kind of a large oval palm pad with a prominent heel, and then 3 claw-like toes, which sunk in to a depth in the ground about 1.5 inches. And then from the toe to the heel prints, they measured about 14 inches in length. So a Bigfoot, maybe Bigfoot, a Bigfoot, and at the widest portion, about 7 inches across. This is a huge footprint. And the stride was astounding to them, measuring 3 feet per step. So something with very long legs, something very tall, they thought. And so to their knowledge, this was something also very heavy as well as tall and with long legs here. The Rock Hill Herald from July 28, 1988, quoted Trooper Hodge saying he was pretty spooked because to him the tracks were too consistent to be faked. They were deep down in that hard-packed dirt. They both tried to stomp on the ground. They couldn't make a track that was equal to that. And to them is also baffling how a hoaxer could take that small window of opportunity between them first passing the bent barrels in the trash and the broken branches, because they made kind of a big loop and they came back, I don't know, just a few minutes later, and then they saw prints that weren't there before. Like, well, that's taking a pretty big risk. They see that there's a law enforcement out here and they're going to decide to freak us out even more by leaving prints. That's possible, but you're taking a risk being caught. So there's a small opportunity to do that around as they're turning around on the car.
There's another suggestion somewhere in Lyle's book and I thought this was pretty clever, of someone strapping something onto a horse's feet, onto a horse's hooves.
Yes. Yeah. You could have,
and then it would be a straight line. It would be a long stride, to the point it was like that. Well, then they must have missed the tracks when they went by the first time, because they went by down to where the broken branches were, and then they turned around and came back, and that's when they saw the tracks. And I'm like, how could this have happened that fast? Did somebody ride a horse with things clamped to his feet across, or did they just miss the tracks the first time around? I don't know.
That's all. It's all possible. So it's vague, but these guys are freaked out. These things go on for quite a while. They said for 300 yards until they kind of vanish into the brush.
Yeah.
And again, it's easy, even as a police officer, to get freaked out. And, of course, that happens here. But they block off the road. Then they have the sheriff come down, Truesdale, to inspect the site. And he also thought it looked kind of suspicious. So then they call into the state law enforcement division, and that's when they request the bloodhounds. And then he also sends an officer back to get some plaster casting materials.
Well, Lyle had mentioned the George Holloman sighting and the George Plyler account several times. So let's get into a little more detail on those. Holloman sighting was one of the people whose name was initially given to Truesdale as a witness. He finally came forward about 10 months earlier. George Holloman, 31 years old, construction worker, resident of Browntown, had encountered something near the Scape Ore Bridge. He was riding his bike on the back roads of Browntown in early October, and around midnight, he parked his bike on the south side of the Scape Ore Bridge to drink water from a natural artesian spring. George was having a smoke and looked across the road to the other side of the swamp when something caught his eye. The official police report from August 13th, 1988 states that, quote, he thought he saw what was a dead tree that lightning had struck, end quote. But then the dark shape stood up like a man. George described the being as 7 to 8 feet tall, black-colored, and maybe covered in hair. The hair stood straight up on my head, and all the muscles got tight in my arms. This thing eyeballed George Holloman until a car passed by, and in the headlights, George could see the eyes shine and describe them as big and red. The car passing seemed to cause the creature to slink back into the darkness of the swamp. George got on his bike and rode away as fast as he could, later stating, "I didn't hesitate. It went in the swamp, and I went that away." It sounds like my great-grandfather.
Yeah.
After a couple of weeks, he finally told someone, his family. His brother teased him about being drunk, and his mother said he had seen a haint, which is a southern variation of haunt, or meaning ghost. Which that's
Have
a
you
word
heard
I've
that?
in North Carolina?
You've heard that?
Absolutely.
Haint?
In North
You got
Carolina.
hainted.
Yeah. He did a few TV interviews too, and his description of what he saw, it never wavered.
No, he was consistent, and again, apparently freaked out, told only a few people, gets made fun of, some take it seriously because they've heard other things. Typical response here, but he genuinely seemed to be weirded out by it. Well, soon after George Holloman came forward, there's another resident who made a statement to the police about seeing an unusual creature as well, and he remembered this is happening in the spring of 1986, over 2 years before
Right.
Chris Davis encounter happened.
This is what they were saying when they were saying the stories were out there. And Chris had heard some of these stories,
Right.
apparently. So it's a small community.
Yeah, and most people, you kind of, it's just tall tales. You dismiss it. It didn't happen to you, and you don't have much information. It's like, oh, that's, it's like the hook. It's like all these urban legends. Kids
Right.
out in the woods by the old abandoned asylum, and then they were making out, and there's a hook hanging on the door after as they drove home. Like that's a thing. There's always that evidence. It's so movie-like. Here, it's not too movie-like. We will come across an encounter that's a little more movie-like, but in this case, it's just he saw something weird, tall, black stand up in the swamp, got a creepy feeling, took off after that, still seemed to be freaked out, tells some people in some interviews, but never wavers here. But what I love about this is that, Chris isn't the first instance of this. Like I said, over 2 years before this happened, there's a man named George Plyler who had an incident here. Now, he's not alone. He's got 3 workers at his house on Springvale Road. This is around sunrise, early in the morning, and he described what he saw to the state newspaper. Quote, "I had 3 workmen putting a hog pen in the swamp in quicksand that came up to your knees and waist." Well, that sounds frightening alone. But they had gotten out to the middle when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck raise up like someone was watching me. I turned around and I thought it was a deer glancing out around the tree, end quote. So here he's got other witnesses, but he does not alert them because he's like, what the heck is that? And he's a little afraid how they might react. Also, he doesn't know what he's looking at here. So he goes on to say, Plyler, that its, quote, "face was shaped like a human's, its eyes were red around the pupils, and its arms hung like an ape's." And then a few seconds later, this animal takes off running on 2 legs like a man. Plyler continues on. "It broke and ran, parting the brush both ways."
Yeah.
So
whatever that is, it's like, these guys know what bears are, and this predates what happened to Christopher. So
not running like a bear. I've seen bear take off into the brush. This is more human-like. So whatever it is just freaky looking. And again, as he says here, the features were more like a human than any animal I've ever seen. The arms were a bit longer than normal human being arms, but the legs were long and skinny, along with a little body. Now, this was from an interview for the Australian TV program, Animal X, Natural Mystery Unit. Well, that sounds like a fun show.
Yeah.
But they asked him, it's like, did you think it resembled a lizard? And Plyler explains, like, well, it had a body maybe similar to a lizard, except for the head. And it didn't have a tail or anything like that.
The tail comes and goes. This tail has no shortage of missing tails.
It does come and go. I don't know if that makes it, here's what we're talking about, whether it gets more frightening or less frightening or more acceptable, less acceptable with the description variations. Like a very long tail, like, well, that's kind of frightening. That's more animal-like. But but then if it doesn't, it's more human-like. That's also more frightening. So
the other thing that's hilarious about Plyler is like, he's so worried that no one's going to come finish his fence that he doesn't tell the guy. He's the only one that sees it. They're like, they're in the quicksand putting the fence up or whatever, and he's looking behind him, and they're like, what? And he's like, oh, nothing. Can we finish this? He doesn't tell anybody, or he doesn't tell, he doesn't want the word to get out until the fence is
That's
done.
right. No, it's very practical. And again, a straight shooter, but it's early in the morning. He needs the job to get done before it gets really hot and muggy. So he didn't tell them. And he thought that, like, okay, this guy's a wacko. We're not going to, plus he just paid them. But again, this is before there was any talk of a lizard man. Plyler didn't describe it as that. He just described what he saw. So, but he goes back to the spot where it was standing because it wasn't that far away. So he remembers exactly where it was. And
Right.
that's when he finds really strange, odd 3-pronged tracks in this soft mud.
Yeah.
And he didn't have a ruler with him, but he estimated their size to be about 12 to 18 inches long on average. So again, huge footprints, very odd.
Well, Christopher Davis did make money on this. Everybody's like, "Oh, he's only doing this to make money." He did become kind of a local celebrity. He was signing things. There were T-shirts made. And in fact, Joy Reese, whose quote we used in the opening of the show, actually convinced Chris that she should be his manager, and then started charging for his appearance. So they sold T-shirts with him. There was an illustration of the Lizard Man. Reportedly, he made about $3,500 from autographs and T-shirt sales. So that was good money, but he's kind of shy, and he also didn't like being ridiculed, which you can imagine being a 17-year-old. Like, all your friends are probably making fun of you too. So he told the state newspaper, quote, "I didn't want it to happen, but it did." End quote. He missed a lot of his high school's basketball season from all interviews and appearances, which upset him. Asked if he would report his Lizard Man encounter again, if he had it to do over, he replied, quote, "No, it wasn't worth it. I couldn't do my job and I couldn't play basketball," end quote. So I thought that was interesting. That's the kind of thing. No, it's not worth it. I don't want this attention. It's like Ronnie with the Delphus ring, or a lot of these witnesses that come forward. They're living their lives and trying to get by, and they're just like, this wasn't worth it. That is a recurring theme with actual experiencers. It wasn't worth it. There's a different way that the stories proceed and the people react to them, who are the ones that are the attention seekers. They have a whole different MO. The folks that it seems more believable that something happened are the ones that are like reluctant or regret it. And it doesn't matter. He made a little money, whatever. I don't care. I was like, I couldn't live my life. I couldn't be who I was, So
Right.
I think that lends veracity to it. But along those lines, they finally took that lie detector test, right?
It's at this point that they are given a lie detector test. This would be August 18th, 1988. This happens at the Sumter City County Law Enforcement Center. And a former Sumter police detective named Rick Welch and his partner, Randy Galloway, they paid for the test because they'd actually been working with Chris on some of his appearances. And two things, they wanted to satisfy their own curiosity, but they also wanted to set the record straight, because some of the media were saying that Chris Davis was on drugs. He's on goofballs. That's why he's seeing this weird things. And so they like this kid. They trust him. And they wanted to help prove his point here. So they administered the test. And Captain Earl Berry, he concludes that Chris was being truthful in every question that was put forth to him. But as we know, lie detector testing it's highly debated, not accepted. But then again, it is that ironic thing where people will say like, well, they're highly fallible. They don't, that's why they're not admissible in court, but they still want you to take one.
Right.
And if you don't pass it, they hold that against you,
Right,
so,
right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't win either way, but they pass the test. And it's like, well, yeah, they saw something that we're scared of. But here we have another incident. And this is about a month before Chris's incident. As we were discussing, this is from Frank Mitchell, who is a crop duster, also very well known by the local farmers and everybody in the community. There's very few goofballs in this story. There are a few.
Yeah, and this is the creature that Lyle mentioned, a pilot looking down and seeing running across his runway as he was taking off.
This sighting is compelling. I think it's from the angle of the plane, and it reminds me of a Stephen King story. Well, that was a vampire who was flying around locally in a small plane that he flew.
Right.
But just seeing something strange on an airport there, it's kind of out of context here, but he got a good look at it. And as he said, some quote unquote thing walked across the runway as he tried to take off. That would also be very disturbing. You're trying to take off in this thing, kind of. Yeah. What his description was, Frank Mitchell's, quote, "I couldn't tell if it was scaly or hairy, but it was a grayish brown thing with a face like a monkey." Continuing on, he says, "When I got in the air, I made as quick a turn as possible, but by the time I got turned around, it was gone." Whatever this thing was, it came out of the woods on one side of the airstrip. It did its loping, lumbering kind of thing across the open grass there, and then it goes and disappears into the trees on the other side of the airstrip. So this is I believe a grass airstrip here, but just flat enough. You've seen them before, rural, so it's not paved, but this thing just kind of came out of the brush, crossed over, He tries to turn the plane around, it's gone already, but he
Right.
got a good look at it. And then again, he didn't say anything. He didn't want his neighbors to think he was crazy. He's also relying on them for business because he is dusting their crops and spraying their fields. And, if this guy's crazy and he's flying a plane over your property, like maybe you don't want to do business with him.
Yeah, right.
So he just keeps mum about it and doesn't say anything.
There's another sighting that holds some water, and this is one that Lyle mentions as being a more credible sighting. This happened on August 26, 1988. That was my 19th birthday that day, by the way.
Oh,
so.
Congratulations.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is Colonel Mason Phillips. He was a high-ranking officer in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was driving along McDuffie Road near Ashwood Lake, which is where the other quote about the woman being found with her head twisted off and animals pulled apart. That's where Ashwood Lake is. It's about 8 miles from Browntown, southeast. So he and his wife saw a large brownish creature emerge from the shadows and cross the road, moving fast on 2 legs. The Lee County Observer published the account on August 31st, describing it, quote, about 8 feet tall with a tail that did not quite reach the ground, end quote. So there we go again with this tail situation. Now, the colonel made a report to the Lee County Sheriff's Office. Deputies investigated but found no tracks because of the recent rains.
Right.
A polygraph and hypnosis were suggested but never happened.
No, but I also just want to quickly say that, I don't know, did you just mention Colonel Mason Phillips is a pseudonym because this guy is such a high-ranking officer? Well, I think he's...
I didn't mention that. Yeah.
He's a full colonel. Let's step below general there. So pretty high-ranking officer. Doesn't want to be called into question about... odd things he's seeing.
Right.
But it is a more credible sighting by, again, somebody in a higher status of society. But, they can be weird and wacky and misinterpret and misidentify things. So take that as you will. But again, a more credible witness. And then people say, well, he didn't come forward with his real names. How can we trust him? It's like, what do you want? So he's going by a pseudonym here, but he was of such conviction that he did make a police report to Sheriff Truesdale, which he didn't have to do if he was worried about possibly getting doxxed, as you say.
Yeah.
So they did investigate, as he said, and, it is that Kolchak thing. It's like, well, there was tracks, but now there's rains, and then there's, nothing.
Yeah.
And then one last thing I'll mention about this, it's one of the few accounts that talks about a long tail. That almost goes to the ground. The other descriptions do not usually have a tail, but sometimes a tail is mentioned.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind, folks.
Well, we have to mention somebody that we've brought up on the show before, Eric Beckyard, who was a Bigfoot researcher and cryptozoologist who founded the Cryptozoology Museum project located in Malibu, California. And when he heard about this story, and this is from Lyle's book, he found Christopher Davis and asked him for an interview. Now, as a result of this interview and taking into consideration other circumstantial evidence, such as tracks, car damage, and other sightings, Beckyard decided, in what might be considered one of his more astute moments, that it was not a lizard man that was haunting Bishopville, but a type of Bigfoot.
Right.
He theorized that it was a skunk ape. He said swamp mud may have been caked and dried, giving the appearance of scaly skin, and it was probably attracted to the load of fish burgers from McDonald's in Chris Davis's car. So
I don't think it was a load. I think there was probably one. It's his dinner he got to take home from work.
Fish
but however, not to make light of that though, is that lizard thing lives near a swamp, fishy smell. They smell good.
From 50 yards away, it smelled the fish sandwich in his car, you think? Or 30 yards?
Bears can.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, you talk about a quarter mile.
He's changing that tire and the windows down, like we said, like we joked about. Yeah, maybe that's a possibility.
If I'm not mistaken, it was Eric Beckyard who started talking about the liminality of Bigfoot sightings.
That's right.
Right? And
that's why
it could be interdimensional.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's like you find, out in the middle of the snow, you find 1 or 2 footprints, nothing leading up to it, nothing leading away.
Right.
Or half a footprint.
Right.
And they're just disappearing into nothing. So,
yeah.
But he is controversial anyway. And then there was a second cryptozoologist who thought the tracks were made by a horse with fake claws. There you go.
Yeah, that was what I was talking about. Right.
This cryptozoologist thought that this encounter, as described by Davis, might have some truthiness to it or merit because it then started to sound like other Bigfoot encounter descriptions.
The other sighting that comes up a lot, and Lyle mentions in our talks with him, is the Blyther's family sighting.
Right.
A little bit more description of something unusual here. Bertha Blythers and her 5 children, ages 19 to 2 twin boys, age 4, were heading back from a burger joint to their home in Camden, traveling west along Browntown Road. They also happened to be reminiscing and discussing the lizard man.
Oh, there you go.
Around 10:30 p.m., they were crossing the interstate and approaching Hickory Hill Road. Tamasia, the oldest daughter of the family, was sitting in the front passenger seat when a large being suddenly appeared and lunged toward the right side of their vehicle, heading for Tamasia's open door window. Tamasia screams and Bertha swerves the car to get away from the creature. She later told police, quote, "I was looking straight ahead, going about 25 miles per hour, and I saw this big brown thing. It jumped up at the window. I quickly sped up and went on the other side of the road to keep him from dragging my 11-year-old girl out of the car," end quote.
Oh, that's frightening. Yeah.
So they get past this thing, and Bertha slows down when her 19-year-old son, Johnny, takes a look back and exclaims, "Mother, it's still there." Whatever it was big, human-like, and walking on 2 legs while hunched over as it lumbered across the road and faded into the darkness. Bertha kept driving as her terrified daughter cried. Bertha gave a statement to the Lee County Sheriff's Office testifying that the being had, quote, 2 arms like a human, wide and tall. Although she only saw this thing from the waist up and didn't notice any of its facial features, she was sure it was covered in brown hair and big. "I've never seen anything like it before," she told the police. "It wasn't a deer or a bear. It was definitely not a person either." Again, that's from Lyle's book. And what's fascinating about this to me is that the word wide comes up in a couple of different descriptions.
Again, differing from other descriptions, not only just the long arms.
Yes.
And somebody had described earlier a skinny body.
Yeah.
Now we're getting a wide body.
That's right.
So that's the big question coming up here, starting to form and gel. Is this all the same creature? Or what are these things?
Right. And Johnny, her son that looked back and saw it, he told the police that it was definitely something over 6 feet tall or more, covered in brown hair with 2 large eyes. And he said, quote, "I certainly don't think it was a human dressed in something because a human ain't going to jump in front of a car," which is absolutely valid point.
That makes sense. Sure.
Yeah. He begged his mom to turn around, hoping they could see this thing again. But Bertha said there was no way she was going to turn the car around. And I'm with her on this. Now, after Bertha's sister convinced her to file a police report, Deputy Ed Corey inspected the scene of the encounter, but found no tracks or trace of whatever this thing was. The next day, Bertha and her 2 oldest children, Johnny and Tamasia, gave their statements to Sheriff Truesdale. They were interviewed separately, and the sheriff found them to be credible. The Blythers wanted no attention from TV or reporters, only to tell the authorities the truth about their encounter. Johnny especially was familiar with what Chris Davis had gone through, and that served as a warning not to go public. Truesdale, once again, couldn't be certain what the Blythers had seen. He was just convinced they had seen something out of this world, and either they were hoaxed or the lizard man or some type of cryptid was still roaming the area.
There's another close call here, as described in the book. And this happens not too long after the Blythers have their encounter. There was another sighting. This was a bank vice president from Florence, South Carolina, who went deer hunting near Scape Ore Swamp when he claimed to see a creature resembling the lizard man near his tree stand. But since he has such a prominent job in business, he didn't want to go public, so he only told a few friends. And then in the fall of 1991, another encounter. And this time they did sort of go public, or they gave statements here. And this is the couple, Brian and Michelle Elmore. This couple here, Brian and Michelle Elmore, they're driving to a late night party. And this is around just 30 minutes after midnight, 12:30. And they're between the towns of Browntown and Cedar Creek. And now they're heading north on Gum Springs Road. On this stretch of road, they almost run into a large animal, something like a gorilla. And they were frightened by the near collision, but they, again, decided to keep quiet about it, like so many others, because they were afraid of getting mocked. So this wouldn't be until May of 1992 that they then decide they should tell their story to Sheriff Truesdale. Now, according to Brian Elmore, some kind of animal caught his eye as it crouched down to the side of the road and then becomes illuminated by the headlights as he's approaching it. So according to his signed statement to the police, Brian says, all of a sudden I saw something standing straight up on the side of the road. I asked Michelle, "Did you see what I saw?" And it had its arms over its head. And Michelle said, "It must have been a cow." And I said, "I didn't think it was a cow." So we turned around. We went back to the place where I saw it. And when we got near it, the lights hit it. Michelle yelled, "Look, don't hit it." It was running in front of the truck. I swerved to miss it, or I would have hit it. It ran in front of us and then ran into the woods.
Scary.
just imagine. I always just wonder, like, seeing something that is impossible.
Yeah.
What that does to your brain. It's something you've never seen. Things you've never seen.
Yeah.
Suddenly seeing them, and like it's just an impossible sight, because again, it's like when you do see a bear or some large animal that's kind of rare. Could be a moose, could be a bear, could be a whale. When people see whales, it's quite breathtaking because it's not an everyday occurrence, and it's such an unusual, rare animal that it makes an impression on you. But something that is nothing like any of those animals,
right?
It does, again, make an impression on you and frightens you. Well, Brian was sure that it did look like a gorilla, but it was much larger.
Right.
But he was sure it was definitely not a gorilla, and it did not have a tail.
Okay.
But he also said it ran humped over and had arms and legs that were not like a gorilla or bear.
Okay.
So Michelle Elmore's police report basically said the same thing. She agreed there. They were driving, and then they spotted something kind of humped over, as they say, by the side of the road. Like it was picking something up, or maybe it was balled up like it was trying to hide by the side of the road. And that's when it saw the headlights, and it suddenly jumped up and ran straight in front of them and into the woods to the opposite side of the road. She said if Brian hadn't hit the brakes and swerved, they would have hit it. They were that close. That's also scary. Like you almost hit something like a large animal.
It also tells you whatever it is doesn't think like a human being, because a human being's not going to risk running in front of a car unless they're having a bout of mental illness or they're a drug problem.
Yeah, we're just impaired somehow. But you're right. That is more like an animal who doesn't understand what that is. Jackrabbits, things that get squashed on the road, they don't know what's happening. They just see lights and freak out. And it's like, well, now's a good time to cross. She did get a good look at it, and she described its appearance as brownish black in color, and its ears kind of midway down on its head, unquote.
Yeah.
She said midway down. That's interesting. About 7 feet tall. She also said it ran humped over like a gorilla would run, and it had very long arms.
Think about that. Carl Stryken, our friend that we interviewed and talked to for our series on giants. So there's a picture of us with him, and you guys all know him. He was in Twin Peaks. He's in Men in Black. He's the really tall dude. He was in the Beatles movie, but he's 7 feet tall. So imagine something as tall as him.
Yeah. And so again, your brain is quickly doing that flashcard thing. Like, what is this? What is this?
Yeah.
What sound does the thing make? Well, they did get a very good look at it because it was illuminated brightly by the car headlights. And they said, both of them said that whatever it was very clearly lit up, and they know what they saw. Michelle saying it was very plain, and she didn't see it at first like Brian did. As Brian said, it was standing straight up and it had its arms over its head.
Yeah.
But both first had thought, because I think of the size, they thought it was a cow. Like, what else is that big? And that was before they got a good look at it. And then this is interesting, when Michelle said they turned around, and that's when she, quote, saw it and realized it was a Sasquatch, end quote.
Yeah, there we go.
So now you have something definite, like we know what a Sasquatch is. We think it's that, not lizard.
Right.
So they're pretty unnerved at this point. And they said, let's not go to that party. Well, we're going to go head straight home to Brian's parents' house to tell them about it. You got to tell somebody.
Yeah.
And so they didn't tell many other people aside from their parents and just a few others. And then they had the usual reactions. Michelle's quoted as saying, well, the reason I didn't report is because everybody would think I was crazy, and everybody kept saying it was a bear, so I left it at that. Michelle explained. It looked exactly like a Sasquatch to me.
It's always the people that aren't there that tell you what you saw.
Well, you can't, because they don't want to face the possibility that it's not a cow. Or even an escaped gorilla from the zoo. That's another common thing. Like Lyle talks about that in the book.
Yeah, the circus train wreck.
The circus train derailed, and all these animals got out, and they've just been living in the woods breeding elephants with giraffes and apes and orangutans and all kinds of stuff. Well, Brian and a friend did go out to the scene like you and I do the next day, but they didn't find anything. Again, it doesn't make sense. If it was a hoax, I would imagine they would maybe find something to back up their story, but not necessarily. No, just putting that out there. Sheriff Truesdale, again, found this report pretty credible. Same feeling he'd gotten about the Blyther's family report, also credible. And also, everyone's consistent with their details. And it was very similar descriptions between the two parties about the way this thing looked and moved.
Well, one thing that you can take from Lyle's book, which is really, I think, the crux of the message here, because a lot of times when people look at these stories and, oh, this is kitschy, it's this one little thing, and now they have a festival every year, which these guys do, and all of that kind of stuff happens. But there's a lot more to this one than most of them. And that's why he was intrigued with it. That's why he wrote the book on it, and which led to lots and lots of other books that he's now writing. He's digging up these stories that have a lot more to them than just one guy saw this thing. And when the people start coming out of the woodwork, you have to be able to evaluate what's happening here. And it's not as silly as it seemed on the surface. Well, we're going to close out here with Lyle, but first I got to say, I might be leaning toward mistaken identity here. Lyle makes a pretty good case for the possibility of this thing being some kind of skunk ape version of the Sasquatch that had been misidentified due to matted, swampy, mud-covered hair, maybe, or being seen at night. But also, it just seems so aggressive, more than you hear about with most Bigfoot encounters.
That's true. Yes, that's I did kind of bring that up a little bit with Lyle, but to ask you to clarify, are you saying misidentity and that this thing was a cow? And
no, I'm saying misidentity. I think we definitely got a cryptid here. I just think I don't know. See, the thing is, I believe Christopher Davis too. But like in the dark, you know, this is where you start to get to like splitting hairs. But
tail or no tail.
Yeah, tail or no tail. Does it have lizard-like fingers? But what do fingers look like on a Sasquatch that lives in a swamp? I don't know. I have no idea. Like,
that's also,
you don't have
as you remember,
vocabulary. You don't know what you're looking at because you don't have. And when I say, I don't mean the vocabulary literally in terms of the words. I mean, right. You have never experienced this kind of encounter. How do you describe it? And you know, what is this? Or is there more than one thing happening here? Are there skunk apes and Bigfoots, them kind of being the same thing? And then also some kind of lizard humanoid thing, like whatever's happening. Maybe if a lot of people are seeing something, it's because there's a lot of things going on.
I'm going to go with that.
Okay.
I'm going to say multiple weird beasts, creatures. I don't want to call them beasts. They're maybe they're sentient. Maybe they're not just smart enough to run across the road as the car approaches, but more animalistic. Where do you draw the line here? What's more scary? Is that these things more animal or more human? When you start talking about humanoids, is that more unbelievable? When you talk about Bigfoots, it's like, well, okay, it's just an undiscovered type of primate. And they just manage to live in the woods. And yes, they're elusive, but they're smart enough to, they bury their dead, they cover their scant, whatever they do to stay elusive like that. They're just an animal, but very human-like. And again, just the foot. You always remember this, folks, is that it's not a gorilla foot. It's very much like a human foot. They have much more human characteristics. Is it the missing link scientists have been looking for? Or is it just an animal? But it's safer knowing it's just an animal. Thinking about that, like, oh, they're scary. You don't want to run into one.
Yeah.
He could rip you in half and stuff you in a tree trunk, but it's just an animal. Where now there's a lizard man. It's like, okay, that's even less likely because that shouldn't be happening. Like, yeah, some kind of cross between monkey and human. Okay, maybe I'll give more believability to that, but something that's reptilian, no, that's even more frightening. As Lyle talks about in the monster movies, a creature from the Black Lagoon. It's just like, that is just nightmare fodder, more so than Bigfoot, perhaps, even a rogue Bigfoot. But what's the behavior going on here? Can we even track it? Would Caesar Milan even know what's going on? Not that he studies dogs. It was a dog man. I do think that it sounds like there's several descriptions, again, from the credible reports, especially you don't mistake something like a tail.
Yeah.
And not going to go there, folks. But just when you start thinking about the appendages that could be misidentified, it's pretty clear here. And I would grant some leeway to, well, what you were actually seeing was slimy, matted fur, longer hair like Momo. If you think about the skunk ape and a regular Bigfoot or Patty or these different, there's different species or varieties of them.
Yeah.
In different regions, some living more towards the water, being different, smelling different, looking different. We're all trying to put this into one thing. Is this a lizard? Is this Bigfoot? Could it be several different things? Could it be lizard-like at one moment and to one viewer? Or could it be more Bigfoot to somebody else in that moment, to that person?
Or could it be a paranormal, interdimensional circus train accident in the Scape Ore Swamp?
I will go with that as well. I like that idea. In that there's a flow, a river, a overlapping, fading in of one dimension and reality into ours momentarily. And that's when these things kind of fade in, and they're just as scared as we are, as I said, Lyle. They're just as freaked out. maybe that's why they cross the road. Like, where am I supposed to go here? I just popped in for a second. What is this thing? And then this happens, and then they're gone again. But for whatever reason, Scape Ore Swamp and the nearby vicinity is a thin place, a thin, swampy, blackwater, brackish place.
I did want to ask Lyle about something he mentioned in his book before we close out here. It's about a humanoid cryptid that pretty much exactly matches the overall idea of the lizard man, even if the lizard man is just a bad label for a skunk ape. I did want to mention something real specific, and this is on page 111 of Lyle's book, Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster, which, folks, this is the world's foremost expert on the lizard man right here. So I would say you guys definitely need to check this book out or any of Lyle's other books. But my question for you is, when you guys talked about in the book the early history of the Creek Indians and their neighbors from 1922, John Swanton's book, which mentions this excerpt about the Insignanin. This is really fascinating. It was like, I guess that comes from a book called Decades of the New World, which you may already know this. I'm sharing this for our listeners. So this is just a little bit of a description here from Wikipedia. Decades of the New World by Peter Martir d'Anguillera is a collection of 8 narrative tracts recounting early Spanish exploration, conquest, and colonization of the New World, exploration of the Pacific, and related miscellany. And it talks about when they were published and everything. But this section that you guys have, which is also in early history of the Creek Indians and their neighbors, can also be found on page 261 of that book, the eight decades of Peter Martir d'Anguillera, which has a very pronounced sort of Spanish. The Spaniards are awesome, and anything anyone says is crazy is stupid, which you will take away from this, because at the end of the section that I'm about to quote, it's I think the person says, and other nonsense like this, just immediately calls it nonsense. But going back to, it's the same thing you quoted on page 111. I'm going to read it here too from the 8 decades of Peter Martir d'Anguillera. Quote, there is another country called Insignanin, which I don't know how to pronounce that, Insignanin, whose inhabitants declare that, according to the tradition of their ancestors, there once arrived amongst them men with tails a meter long and as thick as a man's arm. This tail was not movable like those of the quadrupeds, but formed one mass, as we see is the case with fish and crocodiles, and was as hard as a bone. When these men wished to sit down, it says men there, by the way, when these men wished to sit down, they had consequently to have a seat with an open bottom, and if there was none, they had to dig a hole more than a cubit deep to hold their tails and allow them to rest. Their fingers were as long as they were broad, and their skin was rough, almost scaly. They ate nothing but raw fish, or a fish fillet, and when the fish gave out, they all perished, leaving no descendants. Those fables and other similar nonsense have been handed down to the natives by their parents. That is interesting. If you had this species of beings that indigenous people, Native Americans, remembered from way back when in this country, isn't it plausible that maybe some of them have somehow survived, or they're there? Or if you want to combine multiple paranormal events, you take this species of beings, and then you also have time slips happening in the swamp, and people are looking into the past and encountering things. There's some kind of overlap there where they're seeing things from the past, like stories that we've covered in the past about time slips, like the Palace of Versailles and that sort of thing. Except instead of seeing the Palace of Versailles during Napoleon's days, we're seeing these creatures that used to live in this same area, but they aren't there anymore, just for a minute, where our time is crossing because of the bubbles of the infinite universe or whatever. What do you guys have any? I mean, I know I went kind of far there on that. Any thoughts on that? This creature sounds a lot like what people saw. This man or whatever this thing was that apparently lived there and ate fish.
What are the chances? I mean, that you could find some mention of something so similar in the past.
Yeah.
The Native Americans had a story of. I'll tell you this, Christopher Davis, there is no way he knew anything about this.
Right.
Well, let me make up something that sounds plausible. It's been here for hundreds of years or in the past. No way.
Yeah.
So that is at the very least, is very coincidental and very odd. And your conjecture there or speculation, hey, who's to say? I mean, that's provided the seeds of which you're drawing that speculation from to say that perhaps some have survived, or perhaps there's some crossover from the past or whatever. which would be as good as anything to explain what was going on, because again, there are credible people, and there was people who saw something that fit that general description that were interviewed by a professional lawman. So something happened, and that's as good of an explanation as any we could find. I think, for as long as we've had recorded history and further back, oral history and tales, we've just been fascinated with monsters. And, anybody who comes forward and says they've seen anything like this, we're infinitely fascinated with, or at least guys like us and the listeners, who think these are interesting. And I don't think it's ever going to stop, because we're interested in that, and we're focused on trying to sort out the truth of the matter. And we may never, it may just be an enduring monster mystery forever, but that there's no lack of them, and they continue. Even the Native Americans apparently, these tales were interesting enough for them to tell someone else. So therefore it got recorded. They were, that was like early podcasting. They sat around the fire and,
Right.
Hey, I heard this weird story about these guys with tails, and they said men. They didn't say monsters or creatures.
That's right.
They're in pursuit of these bipedal things that are just out of reach, and they're similar enough to us because they can stand on two legs, and they're seemingly somewhat intelligent. They can hide from us, but at times they'll try to attack or terrorize us. That'll never go away, and they're fascinating no matter what the truth is in the Lizard Man story. The proof is not the whole story. It's the fact that in modern day, in the 1980s, this wasn't made up for Stranger Things. This literally happened. People in this town in modern America said they saw an upright reptilian creature from the Black Lagoon that lived near their town. The police went after it. The media just went crazy with this. And the whole story therein of the phenomenon of the interest in monster cases and how that could spread in the news so much that is the story. It's like, whoa, this is just, you can't make this stuff up. It sounds like I'm making up a book. I knocked on the door to this retired sheriff who was going to tell me this story about this creature they once hunted. It sounds like I'm making up a book, and it's 100% facts is what I put in there. These are what the people reported. This is what happened. You, the reader or the listener, make your opinion.
Well, folks, if you want to get the whole story, then you have to get Lizard Man, the True Story of the Bishopville Monster by Lyle Blackburn. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at lyleblackburn.com. That's published by Anomalist Books, who we've mentioned many times on the show before. Lyle, thank you for taking the time to come on here. By the time this show releases, we'll be seeing you in about 6 days, and we can't wait to hang out.
Sounds awesome. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you guys.
That's going to wrap up episode 285 of Astonishing Legends. We're still on our summer schedule of back-to-back shows and breaks, so we'll be back literally next week with our live show as recorded from MonsterFest 2024. Find and subscribe to the other shows from the Astonishing Legends Network, The Midnight Library, Scared All the Time, and Richard Haddam's Paranormal Bookshelf. We'll have links to all of them in our show notes. You can also find us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends.
Astonishing Legends is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell at VW Sound and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also head of research and the social media manager. Our technical producer is Ed Vicola, or as we call him, the Mechanic. Special thanks to our announcer, John Boland.
Hi, I'm Eric Jensen.
Summer says chili.
Hi, I'm Sprinkleface.
SESC.
And I give permission to Astonishing Legends to use my voice.
Use my voice.
However they see fit.
HILL.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane at foundermusic.com. All other music and sound design for the show is composed and created by Alan Carestia.
Our logo was created by Tommy Beaver Design, and our animated graphics for social media and YouTube are done by Joshua Sloan at deadstreetproductions.com.
Every episode going back to September of 2020 has a transcription available on its corresponding webpage at our website. Earlier transcriptions can be made available upon request to astonishingcontact@gmail.com.
Astonishing Legends would not be possible without you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Instagram, Twitter, Discord, Facebook, and YouTube.
You can also visit us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content, including the Patreon exclusive show, Astonishing Junk Drawer, which is available every week. The main show is not. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.